On a morning in the summer of 1544, a fleet appeared on the horizon off the Italian coast. The fishermen of Ischia saw it first, those dark shapes materializing from the haze where the Tyrrhenian Sea met the sky, and they knew immediately what they were looking at. The silhouettes were wrong for merchant vessels, too low in the water, too numerous, too fast. Within the hour, the bells of every church on the island were ringing, and families who had lived for generations in whitewashed houses overlooking the harbor were scrambling up rocky paths toward the fortress of Aragonese Castle, clutching what few possessions they could carry, driving goats and children before them, leaving behind fishing nets and bread still rising in ovens and the accumulated artifacts of ordinary lives about to be shattered. The fleet numbered perhaps 110 vessels. At its head sailed a man who was, at that moment, the most feared human being in the Mediterranean world. He was 66 years old, his beard long since gone white, his body scarred from decades of war at sea. His name was Hayreddin, but the Christians who whispered about him in the ports of Spain and Italy and France called him by another name, the name his older brother had carried before him, a name that had become synonymous with terror across 3,000 miles of coastline. They called him Barbarossa. And on this particular morning, with the summer light catching the spray from 100 galleys cutting through the blue water toward the Italian shore, he was not raiding for plunder. He was raiding for a woman. The story that brought Hayreddin Barbarossa to Ischia that summer morning is one that the sources tell with varying degrees of reliability, and like so much about the Barbary Corsairs, it exists at the intersection of documented fact and Mediterranean legend. What is certain is this. The Corsair fleet struck the island with devastating efficiency, overwhelming the defenses, capturing thousands of inhabitants, and carrying them away to the slave markets of North Africa. What is less certain, but persistently claimed in both European and Ottoman sources, is that the raid was commissioned by the French king Francis I, who wanted Barbarossa to capture a specific noblewoman, the Duchess of Fondi, as a gift for the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The Duchess, Giulia Gonzaga, was reputed to be the most beautiful woman in Italy. She escaped, according to legend, by fleeing on horseback in her nightgown through the darkness while the Corsairs burned her town around her. The raid on Ischia was not an isolated event. It was one operation in a summer-long campaign that saw Barbarossa's fleet devastate the western Italian coastline from Naples to Rome, capturing an estimated 7,000 people in a matter of weeks. The Corsairs moved with a coordination and intelligence network that European naval forces could not match, appearing where they were least expected, withdrawing before relief could arrive, treating the entire Mediterranean as a hunting ground in which Christian kingdoms were merely the game. And they did this not as outlaws or brigands, but as official agents of the most powerful empire on earth, flying the banner of the Ottoman Sultan, blessed by religious authority, operating with the explicit cooperation of the Christian king of France. This is the story of the Barbary Corsairs. It is a story that stretches across 3 centuries, from the early 1500s to the 1830s, encompassing the rise and fall of maritime powers, the enslavement of over 1 million Europeans, the forging of hybrid civilizations on the North African coast, and the slow transformation of the Mediterranean from a Christian lake into a contested frontier. It is a story of terrifying naval warriors like Barbarossa and Dragut and Ulu Chali, men who built personal empires on the decks of swift galleys and died as legends. It is a story of the ordinary people they captured, the fishermen and farmers and nuns and children who vanished from European shores and reappeared in the slave markets of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, where some were ransomed, some converted, some died in chains, and some rose to become corsairs themselves. It is a story that shaped the coastlines of Europe in ways still visible today, in the watchtowers that line the shores of Italy and Spain, in the depopulated regions where villages once stood, in the literature and art and collective memory of societies that lived for generations under the shadow of the raid. And it is a story that remains, despite its scale and significance, strangely forgotten, overshadowed by the more familiar piracies of the Caribbean and the Atlantic, treated as a footnote to Ottoman history rather than the central drama of the early modern Mediterranean that it actually was. To understand how this happened, how a loose confederation of sea raiders came to dominate one of the most contested bodies of water on Earth for 300 years, we must begin where the sources begin, with the men who built it. We must begin with two brothers from a Greek island, sons of a potter and a Greek Christian mother, who transformed themselves through cunning and violence into the founders of a maritime empire. We must begin with the Barbarossa brothers. The historical sources for the early Barbary Corsairs present challenges that any honest account must acknowledge before proceeding. The primary Ottoman source is the Ghazavat-i Hayreddin Pasha, a chronicle dictated by Hayreddin Barbarossa himself, late in his life to his secretary Sayyid Muradi. It is part autobiography, part propaganda, written by a man who had every reason to present his career in the most favorable possible light. The European sources are numerous but fragmented, consisting of diplomatic correspondence, captivity narratives written by former slaves, chronicles compiled by religious orders, and contemporary histories that often treat the Corsairs as demonic figures rather than comprehensible human beings. Modern scholarship, particularly the work of historians like Robert Davis, whose research on Mediterranean slavery transformed our understanding of its scale, has done much to sift evidence from legend. But gaps remain, and where the sources disagree or fall silent, we can only acknowledge the uncertainty and proceed with appropriate caution. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: the brothers who would become known as Barbarossa were born on the island of Lesbos in the northeastern Aegean Sea, sometime around 1474 and 1478. Their father was Yaqub, a retired Ottoman Sipahi, a cavalryman who had been granted land on the island after military service. Their mother was a Greek Christian woman named Katerina, the widow of an Orthodox priest. The family was modest, not impoverished but not wealthy, and the four sons, Ashak, Orus, Huzur, and Ilyas, grew up in a world where the sea was the primary avenue of opportunity. Lesbos in the late 15th century was a crossroads, a place where Ottoman Turkish culture met Greek Christian tradition, where the languages and religions of the eastern Mediterranean mingled in markets and harbors and the holds of merchant ships. The boys would have grown up speaking both Turkish and Greek, familiar with both mosque and church, navigating the complex social terrain of a frontier society where identity was more fluid than the modern mind easily imagines. This background, this immersion in a world between worlds, would prove essential to their later careers, when they would lead crews drawn from a dozen nationalities and negotiate with sultans, kings, and popes. The brothers went to sea young, as most island boys did, working on the small coastal vessels that carried goods between the ports of the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean. Sometime in the 1490s, according to later accounts, they transitioned from commerce to raiding. The distinction was not always clear in the medieval Mediterranean. The same ship that carried grain from Egypt to Constantinople might, on another voyage, attack a Venetian merchant vessel if the opportunity presented itself. Piracy and trade existed on a continuum, and a captain's decision about which activity to pursue on any given day depended on relative strength, available targets, and the complex web of treaties and protections that governed maritime activity. Oruz, the older of the two brothers who would survive to fame, was by all accounts the driving force in these early years. The sources describe him as physically imposing, red-bearded, fierce in temper, and possessed of a charisma that drew men to his service. He was captured at some point during these years, possibly by the Knights of St. John, who operated from Rhodes as a kind of Christian corsair fleet, and spent time as a galley slave before escaping or being ransomed. The experience, if it happened as the sources claim, would have given him first-hand knowledge of the systems he would later prey upon, an education in the mechanics of capture, slavery, and redemption that would serve him well. By the early 1500s, Oruz and Huzur had established themselves as independent sea raiders operating from various ports along the North African coast. The political geography of the region at that moment requires explanation because it shaped everything that followed. The coastline from Morocco to Libya was nominally under the authority of various local rulers: the Hafsid dynasty in Tunis, the Zayanid dynasty in Tlemcen, various local emirs and tribal leaders in the smaller ports. But these rulers were weak, pressed by both internal dissent and the expanding power of the Spanish crown, which had recently completed the Reconquista and was now aggressively projecting power across the western Mediterranean. The Spanish had captured key coastal positions, the presidios, fortified posts at Melilla, Oran, Béjaia, and other harbors from which they could project power, collect tribute, and threaten the independence of the North African rulers. The local populations, a complex mixture of Arab, Berber, and urban commercial classes, chafed under this pressure and looked for defenders wherever they could find them. Into this vacuum of local weakness and popular resentment, the Barbarossa brothers sailed with their growing fleet, offering something none of the local rulers could provide: effective military force capable of challenging the Spanish on the sea. The brothers' rise was marked by a series of increasingly audacious operations. They captured Spanish ships, raided Spanish-held positions, and built a reputation that drew fighters from across the Mediterranean to their banner. They operated from various ports, always staying one step ahead of the Spanish forces sent to destroy them, until in 1516, Oritz made the move that would transform him from a successful pirate into the founder of a state. The city of Algiers at that moment was ruled by a local emir named Salim al-Thumi, who was struggling to resist Spanish pressure. The Spanish had built a fortress on a small island in the harbor, the Peñon of Algiers, from which they could threaten the city and extract tribute. Al-Thumi invited Oritz and his fighters to help drive out the Spanish. Oritz came with his brother Huzur and a force of hardened corsairs and Ottoman volunteers. What happened next depends on which source you trust. The outcome does not. Within weeks of his arrival, Oritz had Al-Thumi strangled and assumed control of the city himself. He declared himself Sultan of Algiers, minted coins in his own name, and began consolidating control over the surrounding region. The takeover was bloody. Sources describe mass executions of Al-Thumi's supporters, confiscation of property, and the establishment of a military regime in which the original inhabitants found themselves subject to the rule of the Corsair Brotherhood. Oritz was building something new, a state organized around the raid, and he would let nothing, not local tradition, not existing power structures, not the deaths of those who opposed him, stand in his way. The Spanish response was swift and massive. In 1518, a large Spanish force landed at Tlemcen, the major inland city of the region, intent on destroying Oritz before he could consolidate his position. Oritz marched to meet them, was defeated, and attempted to escape with a small party of his men. He was caught near the river Salado and killed, fighting to the last, according to the sources that favor him, though the manner of his death varies across accounts. His brother Huzur inherited command of the Corsair forces in Algiers. Here is where the story of the Barbarossa brothers becomes the story of the Barbary states. Huzur, who would later be given the honorary name Hayreddin, meaning goodness of the faith, by the Ottoman Sultan, recognized immediately what his brother's death had made clear. The Corsair enterprise in Algiers could not survive as an independent sultanate. The Spanish were too strong. Local allies were too unreliable. Something more was needed. And so, Huzur did something that his brother, with his ambitions of personal sovereignty, might never have done. He offered Algiers to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I. The offer was accepted. Selim sent reinforcements, artillery, and 2,000 janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry that formed the backbone of the empire's military power. Huzur was appointed Beylerbey, governor-general of the new Ottoman province. What had been a pirate haven under local rule became an official Ottoman territory connected to the resources and legitimacy of the most powerful empire in the Islamic world. The transformation was not merely political. It was ideological. The Corsairs of Algiers were no longer freelance raiders pursuing personal profit. They were, officially and legally, warriors of the faith, conducting jihad at sea against the enemies of Islam. This transformation matters because it explains how the Barbary Corsairs operated for so long and with such impunity. They were not outlaws in the eyes of the Ottoman Sultan or the wider Islamic world. They were frontier warriors conducting a form of warfare that had deep roots in Islamic law and precedent. The capture of Christian ships and the enslavement of Christian people was, in this framework, not merely legal but righteous, a continuation of the eternal struggle between the House of Islam and the House of War. The ransoming of captives was regulated by religious scholars. The treatment of slaves was governed by Islamic legal principles. The entire enterprise existed within a moral and legal framework that, whatever we may think of it from a modern perspective, provided legitimacy and structure that mere piracy could never have sustained. None of this made the experience of capture and enslavement any less horrific for those who suffered it. But it explains why the Barbary states proved so durable, why they could survive military defeats that would have destroyed ordinary pirate havens, why they attracted not just the desperate and the criminal, but also devout Muslims who saw Corsair warfare as a form of religious service. The Barbarossa brothers had built something more than a fleet. They had built an institution. Under Hayreddin's leadership, Algiers became the capital of a maritime empire that would dominate the western Mediterranean for generations. He expelled the Spanish from their fortress in the harbor, finally taking the Peñon of Algiers in 1529 after a long siege. He organized the Corsair fleet into a disciplined force, established shipyards, recruited and trained crews, and developed the intelligence networks that allowed Corsair squadrons to appear where they were least expected. And he began the great raids that would make his name a byword for terror across the Christian world. The scale of these operations defies easy comprehension. In 1534, Hayreddin raided the southern coast of Italy, capturing Fondi and numerous smaller towns, taking thousands of prisoners. In 1538, he defeated a combined Christian fleet at the Battle of Preveza, establishing Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean for a generation. In 1543, in one of the strangest episodes of the era, he was invited by King Francis I of France to winter his fleet at the French port of Toulon, where the Christian cathedral was temporarily converted into a mosque to accommodate the religious needs of his crews, and from which he raided the coasts of France's nominal allies for an entire season. This last detail is worth pausing over because it illustrates something essential about the world in which the Corsairs operated. The Mediterranean of the 16th century was not divided into neat blocks of Christian and Muslim powers, however much ideological rhetoric on both sides might suggest otherwise. The Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of France maintained an alliance against their common enemy, the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, for most of the century. Venice, nominally a Christian power, maintained trading relations with the Ottomans, even as it fought them in periodic naval wars. Genoa supplied the galleys that carried Spanish soldiers to attack Muslim North Africa. The Corsairs of Algiers cooperated with French privateers to raid Spanish shipping. The lines were always more complicated than the Holy War rhetoric suggested. Hayreddin Barbarossa died in 1546, 2 years after that raid on Ischia that opened this account. He was buried in a mausoleum on the Bosphorus near Istanbul, with full honors as a loyal servant of the Ottoman state. The Corsair enterprise he had built, however, was just reaching its stride. The men who succeeded him, captains like Turgut Reis, known to Europeans as Dragut, and Uluç Ali, a Calabrian fisherman who converted to Islam and rose to become admiral of the Ottoman fleet, would carry on the tradition of naval warfare and slave raiding for another 2 centuries. The world they inhabited, the world of the 16th century Mediterranean, was undergoing transformations that would shape everything that followed. The Spanish were pouring silver from the mines of Peru and Mexico into their war against the Ottomans and their North African allies. The Protestant Reformation was dividing Christendom, distracting European powers from the struggle with Islam, and creating new ideological fractures that the Ottomans and their vassals could exploit. Naval technology was evolving, with galley warfare reaching its peak of sophistication before beginning the long, slow decline that would eventually make the oar-powered fleets of both Christian and Muslim powers obsolete. Into this world, the great galleys of the Barbary Corsairs sailed with a freedom that seems almost impossible to modern minds. A fleet could leave Algiers in spring, raid the Italian coast through summer, winter in a friendly port, or even in the harbor of a nominal enemy like Toulon, and return home with thousands of captives and holds full of plunder. The merchants and farmers and fishermen of the Christian Mediterranean lived under a shadow that never lifted, knowing that on any given night the dark shapes of corsair galleys might appear on the moonlit water, and by morning everything they had built would be gone. The captives taken in these raids entered a system of enslavement that was in its way as organized and bureaucratic as the slave systems of the Atlantic world that were developing simultaneously on the other side of the Pillars of Hercules. Upon arrival in Algiers or Tunis or Tripoli, captives were assessed, catalogued, and sold. Their value depended on many factors: age, health, skills, apparent wealth, the likelihood that someone would pay to ransom them. A young, healthy man might be put to work in the galleys, pulling oars under the whip of the comite, the overseer who kept the beat. A skilled craftsman might be set to work in his trade, generating income for his owner. A woman might enter a household as a domestic servant or, depending on her appearance and her owner's inclinations, into a darker fate. A child might be raised to convert, to forget their previous life, to become something new. The bagnios, the great slave prisons of the Corsair cities, housed thousands of captives at any given time. Descriptions from former slaves paint a picture of squalid, overcrowded barracks where men from a dozen nations huddled together, communicating in the pidgin language of the Mediterranean, dreaming of ransom or escape, watching their fellows die of disease and despair. The work was unrelenting. Slaves built fortifications, quarried stone, loaded and unloaded ships, cleaned streets, served in private households, and, most infamously, pulled oars on the galleys themselves, where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. Yet the system was not quite the industrial horror of the Atlantic plantation complex. Islamic law regulated the treatment of slaves and provided, at least in theory, for certain protections. More importantly, the entire system was oriented toward ransom rather than exploitation. A slave's owner had a financial interest in keeping them alive and healthy enough to be bought back. The great Catholic religious orders, the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, maintained permanent missions in the Corsair cities, negotiating ransoms, carrying letters between captives and their families, and occasionally purchasing freedom for those whose families could scrape together the required sum. Wealthy captives might live in relative comfort while their ransoms were arranged. Poor ones might spend years or even lifetimes in bondage, but the possibility of redemption, however remote, shaped the system in ways that made it different from the chattel slavery of the Americas. Some captives found another way out. Conversion to Islam freed a slave from bondage, at least in principle, though the convert was expected to remain in the Islamic world and often entered a kind of client relationship with their former owner. The converts, called renegados in the European sources, became one of the most distinctive features of the Corsair world. Some converted sincerely, embracing the faith of their captors out of genuine conviction. Others converted pragmatically, choosing freedom over slavery, a new identity over chains. A few converted opportunistically, seeing in the Corsair enterprise a chance for wealth and power that their birth circumstances in Christian Europe would never have allowed. The remarkable thing is how many of the most successful Corsair captains were European-born renegados. Ulugh Ali, who would rise to become Capudan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, was born Giovanni Dionigi Galeni in Calabria, the son of a fisherman. Murat Reis the Elder was a Greek from the Aegean. Murat Reis the Younger, one of the most feared raiders of the 17th century, was a Dutch sailor named Jan Jansoen, who converted after being captured. Simon Dansa, who revolutionized Corsair tactics in the early 1600s, was a Flemish sailor. John Ward, known in the Arabic sources as Yusuf Reis, was an English privateer who went over to the Corsairs and became one of the most successful captains of his generation. These men brought skills that the North African maritime tradition lacked: expertise in Atlantic sailing, knowledge of Northern European waters, and familiarity with the round-hulled sailing ships that were beginning to supersede the galley in certain types of naval warfare. Under their influence, the Corsair fleets evolved. By the 17th century, Algiers and its sister cities operated not only the traditional galleys, but also square-rigged sailing vessels capable of operating in the rougher waters of the Atlantic. This technological adaptation allowed corsairs to raid far beyond their traditional hunting grounds. The most dramatic demonstration of this expanded range came in 1627, when a corsair squadron commanded by Murat Reis the Younger descended on Iceland at the very edge of the known world. The raiders struck the remote Westman Islands and parts of the eastern coast, capturing an estimated 400 Icelanders. The captives were taken back to Algiers, where most spent years in slavery. A handful were ransomed, including a woman named Gudridur Simonardóttir, who would later write a memoir of her experiences. The raid sent shockwaves through northern Europe. If the corsairs could reach Iceland, no coast was safe. But the Iceland raid, for all its drama, was an outlier. The core business of the Barbary Corsairs remained the Mediterranean and the waters just outside it. Year after year, decade after decade, the galleys and sailing ships sortied from Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli, raiding, capturing, returning with holds full of human cargo. The rhythm of the enterprise was as regular as the seasons. Spring saw the fleets put to sea after the winter layup. Summer was the hunting season, when the weather allowed operations across the full breadth of the Mediterranean. Autumn brought the last raids before the storms closed in. Winter was for maintenance, negotiation, and the endless administration of the slave economy. The captains who led these expeditions, the Rais, occupied a social position unlike anything in the Christian Mediterranean. They were at once military commanders, business entrepreneurs, and participants in a complex political system that balanced Ottoman imperial authority with local autonomy. A successful Rais might accumulate enormous wealth, own multiple ships, maintain a household of slaves and dependents, and wield political influence in the councils of the Corsair states. He paid tribute to the Ottoman Sultan's representative, the Pasha, who nominally governed the province. He contributed ships and crews to Ottoman naval campaigns when called upon. But in his daily affairs, in his choice of targets, in his distribution of plunder, he was largely his own master. The division of spoils followed established rules. After a successful raid, the cargo and captives were assessed and their value calculated. A percentage went to the Ottoman treasury, a percentage went to the communal fund of the Corsair fleet, a percentage went to the owners of the ships, a percentage went to the Arais themselves, and a percentage was distributed among the crews, with each man receiving shares according to his rank and role. The system was, in its way, more egalitarian than the wage labor of contemporary European shipping, where common sailors received fixed pay regardless of the voyage's success. A Corsair crewman shared in the profits, had a stake in the enterprise, and could, with luck and skill, rise to become a Rais in his own right. This upward mobility was real, and it explains part of the Corsair enterprise's durability. The bannios of Algiers were full of men who would spend their lives in chains, but the quarterdeck of a Corsair galley was also full of men who had started with nothing and risen through ability. The combination of religious legitimacy, profit-sharing, and genuine opportunity for advancement created an institution that attracted talent from across the Mediterranean world. It was meritocratic in a way that the rigid social hierarchies of Christian Europe were not, and it drew to the Corsair ports a stream of adventurers, converts, and desperate men who found in the raid a path that their home societies had denied them. The cities they built, Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli, were among the most cosmopolitan places on earth. Walk through the streets of 16th century Algiers and you would hear Turkish, Arabic, Berber, Spanish, Italian, Greek, and the pidgin lingua franca that served as the common tongue of Mediterranean commerce. You would see mosques and bathhouses and the homes of wealthy merchants built in the Ottoman style but adapted to North African climate and terrain. You would see the fortifications that protected the harbor, the shipyards where galleys were built and maintained, the markets where every product of the Mediterranean world could be bought or sold. And you would see the bagnios, the great slave prisons with their iron gates and their guards and their populations of miserable captives waiting for ransom or death. The population of these cities was stratified in ways that reflected the hybrid nature of the Corsair civilization. At the top were the Turks, the military elite descended from the Janissaries and administrators sent from Istanbul. Below them were the Kululis, the children of Turkish men and local women who formed a middle stratum with their own identity and interests. Below them were the native Arab and Berber populations who had lived in the region long before the Corsairs arrived and who formed the majority of the agricultural hinterland. And interspersed throughout, changing the social mixture in ways that the other groups often resented, were the renegados, the European converts who might rise to any height, but who were never quite fully accepted by any of the other groups. This society was violent, hierarchical, and built on the suffering of captives. It was also, in its way, functional, stable, and capable of projecting power across the entire Mediterranean for 3 centuries. The question of how to judge it morally is one that the sources themselves struggled with, and it is one that any honest account must confront directly. The Christian Europeans who wrote about the Corsairs saw them through a lens of religious hostility and genuine fear. To Spanish chroniclers, French diplomats, and Italian clerics, the Corsairs were the enemies of Christendom, agents of the Antichrist, practitioners of an unholy trade in Christian flesh. The captivity narratives written by former slaves depicted the bannios as hells on earth, places of unimaginable suffering and cruelty. These accounts are valuable historical sources, but they are also works of propaganda intended to raise funds for ransom efforts and to mobilize Christian sentiment against the Ottoman threat. They must be read with awareness of their purpose. The Ottoman and North African sources tell a different story. To the chroniclers of Algiers and the historians of Istanbul, the Corsairs were Ghazis, warriors of the faith, continuing a tradition of holy war that stretched back to the earliest days of Islam. The enslavement of Christians was not a crime, but a legitimate consequence of warfare, governed by Islamic law and constrained by religious obligation. The ransoming of captives was a business, yes, but also a mechanism by which enemies might be brought into the Islamic fold or returned to their people, bearing witness to the power and justice of the Muslim world. These accounts, too, must be read critically, but they represent a perspective that the Western sources rarely acknowledge. Modern historians have tried to navigate between these partisan viewpoints, assembling statistical evidence for the scale of the trade, analyzing the economic structures that sustained it, and placing it in the context of the broader early modern world. What emerges from this scholarship is a picture more complex than either the Christian or Muslim sources alone suggest. The Barbary Corsairs were engaged in a form of warfare and commerce that had ancient precedents on both sides of the Mediterranean. Christian powers operated their own Corsair fleets, most notably the Knights of St. John on Malta, who raided Muslim shipping and enslaved Muslim captives with the same methods, if not quite the same scale. The distinction between piracy and legitimate naval warfare was blurry throughout the early modern world, and the Corsairs of Algiers occupied a position on that spectrum that was not obviously different from the privateers licensed by European monarchs. None of this excuses or justifies the suffering of the million-plus Europeans who were enslaved in North Africa over 3 centuries. But it does complicate the simple narrative of civilizational conflict that both sides promoted. The Mediterranean was a world in which violence, slavery, and plunder were endemic, practiced by Christians and Muslims alike, condemned when enemies did it, and celebrated when one's own side did. The Barbary Corsairs were masters of this world, not aberrations from it. They played the game by the rules that all sides had established, and they played it better than most. The question of why they played it so well, why the Corsair states proved so durable while other pirate havens rose and fell within a generation, requires attention to factors that go beyond individual talent or religious ideology. It requires attention to the material structures, the geography and technology and economics that made the Corsair enterprise possible. The North African coast was, for this particular business, nearly perfect. 1,000 miles of rugged shoreline offered countless coves and harbors where ships could shelter. The prevailing winds and currents of the western Mediterranean favored vessels operating from the south, allowing corsairs to strike European shores and return home with the weather at their backs. The major corsair ports sat behind natural obstacles, sandbars and reefs and difficult approaches that made them hard to attack from the sea. The hinterland, though arid, produced enough food to sustain substantial populations, and trade routes connected the coast to the wealth of the African interior. The galleys that the Corsairs favored were perfectly adapted to this environment, low and fast, powered by oars that made them independent of the wind. They could operate in the light airs and calms that often prevailed in Mediterranean summers when sailing ships lay becalmed. They could run up on beaches, allowing raiders to strike and withdraw before defenders could respond. They required relatively simple maintenance and could be built in local shipyards with local materials. The oars were pulled by slaves, a self-renewing resource that each successful raid replenished. The combination of geography and technology created a system that was extremely difficult for European powers to disrupt. The economic structure was equally favorable. The Corsair states sat astride trade routes connecting the eastern Mediterranean with the Atlantic and connecting the wealth of Africa with the markets of Europe and the Levant. Even when they were not raiding, they could profit from legitimate commerce, charging tolls for passage through their waters, trading African gold and slaves for European manufactures, serving as intermediaries in the complex exchanges that bound the Mediterranean world together. When they were raiding, the plunder itself was only part of the profit. The ransom economy generated enormous flows of cash from Christian Europe to North Africa, as families, churches, and charitable institutions scraped together the funds to buy back captives. This flow of capital sustained a sophisticated financial infrastructure. Algiers and its sister cities had banks, money changers, and credit networks that could move funds across religious and political boundaries. A captive's family in Spain might pay a ransom to a Genoese merchant who would transfer the sum to a correspondent in Livorno, who would forward it to an agent in Tunis, who would finally deliver it to the captive's owner, all without a single coin crossing a hostile frontier. The intermediaries took their cut at each step, but the system worked, and it worked well enough that the ransom economy became a pillar of Mediterranean commerce. The political structure of the Corsair states reinforced their durability. They were technically Ottoman provinces, which meant they could call on the empire's resources when threatened by major European expeditions. But they were autonomous enough that the Sultan in Istanbul could disavow their activities when diplomatic necessity required. This combination of backing and deniability proved extremely useful. When Charles V assembled his Great Armada against Algiers in 1541, Ottoman reinforcements helped defend the city. When France and the Ottoman Empire were negotiating treaties, the Corsairs' raids could be characterized as unauthorized, the work of uncontrollable frontier warriors rather than official Ottoman policy. The failure of Charles's expedition deserves attention because it illustrates the limits of European power against the Corsair states. Charles was at that moment the most powerful ruler in Christendom. He commanded the resources of Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, much of Italy, and the vast wealth flowing from the Americas. He assembled a fleet of over 500 ships and an army of perhaps 24,000 men, including some of the finest soldiers in Europe. He landed on the North African coast near Algiers in late October 1541, intending to take the city by storm. What happened next remains debated by historians. The traditional account, followed by most European sources, is that a massive storm destroyed much of the fleet and forced Charles to abandon the expedition. The Ottoman and North African sources suggest that the defenders fought well and that the storm merely finished what their resistance had begun. What is certain is that Charles's army suffered devastating losses. Thousands of soldiers drowned or killed in fighting during the withdrawal, and the expedition returned to Spain a catastrophic failure. The Corsairs would go on raiding for another 3 centuries. The storm that destroyed Charles's fleet was, depending on your interpretive framework, either divine intervention on behalf of Islam, simple bad luck, or an illustration of the geographic and meteorological factors that protected the Corsair ports from seaborne assault. What it definitely was not was an isolated event. Again and again, over the following centuries, European expeditions against the Barbary states would founder, fail, or achieve only temporary success. The ports were hard to attack, the Corsairs quick to rebuild, and the political will for sustained campaigns against North Africa always competed with other priorities closer to home. The greatest of those competing priorities was the struggle between Christian powers themselves. The 16th century saw Spain and France locked in a conflict that stretched across Italy, the Netherlands, and the Mediterranean itself. The 17th century brought the 30 Years' War, which devastated Central Europe and consumed resources that might otherwise have been turned against the Corsairs. The 18th century saw Britain and France fight a series of global wars that made the Mediterranean a secondary theater at best. Throughout this period, the Barbary states persisted, adapting to changes in technology and geopolitics, continuing to raid and ransom as they had since the Barbarossa brothers first raised their flag over Algiers. The story of how they finally fell, how the 3-century-long dominion of the Corsairs came to an end, belongs to a later portion of this account. For now, what matters is understanding the world they built in its heyday, the world of swift galleys and fortified harbors, of banios and ransom negotiations, of renegado captains and Turkish janissaries, of fear spreading across 1,000 miles of coastline at the mere rumor of a sail on the horizon. In that world, on that summer morning in 1544, Hayreddin Barbarossa's fleet bore down on Ischia with the coordinated precision of long practice. The defenders knew what was coming. They had heard the stories, seen the refugees from other raids, perhaps glimpsed the slave markets where their neighbors had been sold. They scrambled for the fortress, praying the walls would hold, praying the Corsairs would settle for easier targets, praying for rescue that they knew would not arrive in time. The galleys were close now, close enough to see the individual oars rising and falling in their terrible rhythm, close enough to see the men massed on the decks, close enough to hear the drums that set the pace for the final approach. The greatest naval warrior of the age was coming ashore, and behind him came the apparatus of capture, enslavement, and ransom that had already swallowed 100,000 Christian souls and would swallow 100,000 more before it was done. The ships grounded on the beach. The ramps went down, and the men who served under the banner of Barbarossa poured onto the Italian shore. The raid on Ischia lasted 3 days. What the Corsairs did there followed a pattern refined over decades of practice, a choreography of violence and commerce as precise as any military drill. The first wave of men who poured off the galleys were not raiders in the conventional sense, but scouts and specialists, janissaries and experienced corsairs who knew how to read a town's defenses in the first moments of contact. They identified the fortress where the wealthier inhabitants had fled, assessed the strength of the garrison, and made the cold calculation that determined every corsair operation. Was the prize worth the cost of assault, or was it better to strip the undefended areas and withdraw before reinforcements could arrive? On Ischia, the calculation favored thoroughness. The Castello Aragonese, that great volcanic rock fortress rising from the sea, held too many potential captives to ignore. But its walls were thick, its approaches narrow, and Barbarossa had not sailed this far to spend his fleet's strength on a single stronghold. So the Corsairs did what they had learned to do across 100 similar encounters. They surrounded the fortress, they cut off escape by sea, and they began the systematic reduction of everything outside its walls. The villages of Ischia were emptied house by house. Furniture was smashed for hidden compartments, floorboards were torn up, every cellar was searched, every attic broken into, every church stripped of its silver and gold. The people who had not reached the fortress in time, the elderly who moved too slowly, the children separated from their parents in the chaos, the sick and the stubborn and the simply unlucky, all were gathered and bound in the central squares of each village. The Corsairs worked with an efficiency that spoke of long experience. They knew how to secure prisoners for transport, how to minimize the risk of escape or resistance, how to preserve the merchandise they intended to sell, because that is what these people had become in the eyes of their captors. Merchandise. The word seems brutal, and it should, but understanding the Corsair phenomenon requires understanding this central fact. The entire economic structure of the Barbary states rested on the transformation of free human beings into commodities. Every village burned, every ship captured, every coastal raid was ultimately in service of the slave markets of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. The Corsairs were not anarchic destroyers. They were businessmen engaged in one of the most systematic and sustained enterprises of human trafficking in recorded history. The inhabitants of the Castello Aragonese watched from their walls as their neighbors, their servants, their fellow islanders were marched in coffles toward the waiting galleys. They could see the overseers sorting the captives by age and apparent health, the young and strong separated from the old and weak, the women examined with the appraising eyes of men who knew exactly what each would bring in the markets across the sea. They could hear perhaps the screaming, the pleading, the prayers offered in a language the corsairs neither spoke nor cared to understand. And they could do nothing. The garrison of the fortress was sufficient to hold the walls, but not to sortie against the thousands of armed men on the beaches below. The nearest Spanish fleet was days away, perhaps weeks. The mainland authorities, even if they had received word of the attack immediately, could not assemble a relief force in time to matter. This was the fundamental asymmetry that made the Corsair system work. The Mediterranean was too vast, its coastline too long, its population too dispersed for any defensive system to protect every village and every island. The Corsairs could choose when and where to strike, concentrate their forces against isolated targets, and withdraw before any organized response could form. The siege of the Castello Aragonese lasted longer than Barbarossa had hoped. The defenders were determined, the walls were strong, and the Corsair admiral had other raids to conduct before the season ended. After 3 days of probing attacks and fruitless negotiations, a decision was reached that historians still debate. Some accounts say Barbarossa offered terms and the defenders refused, gambling that relief might yet arrive. Others say the Corsairs simply concluded that the fortress was not worth the casualties required to storm it. What is certain is that the fleet eventually withdrew, carrying with them between 2,000 and 4,000 captives, the numbers varying depending on which source one credits. 4,000 people. Fishermen, farmers, craftsmen, servants, priests, children. 4,000 individual lives, each with their own history and hopes and relationships, reduced in the space of 3 days to cargo. They were packed into the holds of the galleys, given barely enough food and water to survive the crossing, and transported across the Mediterranean to a fate that most of them could not even imagine. The journey itself killed hundreds. The holds of Corsair galleys were designed for efficiency, not comfort. Captives were chained in rows, packed so tightly that movement was nearly impossible, left to lie in their own waste for days at a time. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. The weak, the young, the elderly, the sick, all were at risk. The Corsairs accepted a certain percentage of loss as the cost of doing business, factored into their calculations like any other overhead expense. Those who died were simply thrown overboard, their bodies left to the fish and the currents, their names and lives erased from history. The survivors arrived in Algiers to find a city unlike anything they had ever seen. To understand what awaited the captives of Ischia and the million others who followed them over 3 centuries, we must understand the city they were brought to, the Corsair capital that contemporaries called the best fortified place in the world, the scourge of Christendom, the city of slaves. Algiers in the 16th century was a marvel and a horror, depending entirely on which side of its walls you stood. Built on the slopes of a natural amphitheater facing the sea, the city rose in tiers of white buildings from its harbor to the fortress of the Kasbah at its highest point. Its population in Barbarossa's time was perhaps 50,000, rising to over 100,000 by the 17th century, making it one of the larger cities of the Mediterranean world. But what made Algiers unique was not its size. It was the peculiar civilization that flourished within its walls, a hybrid society built entirely on the economics of human capture. The ethnic composition of the city defied easy categorization. At the top of the social hierarchy were the Ottoman administrators and military officers, often Turkish-born, who represented the formal authority of the Sultan. Below them were the Janissaries, the elite infantry who garrisoned the city and provided much of its military muscle, many of them recruited as children from Christian families in the Balkans through the Devshirme system. The native Berber population, the original inhabitants of North Africa, occupied various social positions depending on their relationship to the ruling elite. Arab merchants, scholars, and craftsmen formed another layer of the urban fabric. But what made Algiers truly distinctive was its European population. At any given time, The city held between 20 and 40,000 Christian slaves, making them the largest demographic group within its walls. And alongside them, increasingly integrated into the ruling structure, were the renegados, European-born converts to Islam, who had joined the Corsair enterprise and often risen to positions of extraordinary power. The phenomenon of the renegado deserves particular attention because it challenges simple narratives of religious conflict and ethnic solidarity. The sources are clear that a significant percentage of the most successful Corsair captains were not born Muslim at all, but converted, often voluntarily, from Christianity. Some were captives who chose conversion as a path to better treatment. Others were sailors and soldiers who saw greater opportunity in the Corsair ports than in the rigid hierarchies of Christian Europe. A few were criminals, exiles, or adventurers who simply found the lawlessness of the Barbary coast more congenial than the constraints of their homelands. Whatever their original motivations, once converted, many renegados threw themselves into their new identity with remarkable fervor. They raided their former homelands, captured their former countrymen, and in some cases became more notorious than any native-born Muslim captain. The psychological complexity of these men, their motivations, their self-justifications, their relationships with the societies they had abandoned, remains largely opaque to us. The sources that survive are almost entirely written by their enemies, by the Christian chroniclers and captivity narrators who saw the renegados as traitors and apostates, deserving only condemnation. But the existence of the renegados tells us something important about the nature of identity in the early modern Mediterranean. Religion, in this world, was not simply a matter of private belief, but of legal status, community membership, and economic opportunity. To convert was not merely to change one's theological opinions, but to change one's entire social position, to move from one legal system to another, from one set of rights and obligations to a completely different one. For a poor sailor from Sicily or a prisoner facing a lifetime in the galleys, the calculation was not always as simple as later moralists would have it. The slaves who did not convert, who clung to their Christian faith despite every pressure to abandon it, faced lives of grinding labor and constant degradation. Most were housed in the bagnios, the great slave prisons of Algiers, massive complexes that could hold thousands of captives at a time. The largest of these, the Bagnio Beylik, was effectively a small city within the city, with its own chapel, its own tavern, its own informal economy, all operating under the watchful eyes of Corsair overseers. Life in the Bagnio was brutal, but not uniformly so. The slave population was stratified by skill, value, and likelihood of ransom. Captives of wealthy families, nobles, merchants, high-ranking churchmen were generally treated better than common sailors or fishermen because their ransom value depended on keeping them alive and healthy. These privileged prisoners might be given private quarters, allowed to receive visitors, permitted to write letters home arranging their release. They lived in a kind of suspended animation, neither free nor truly enslaved, waiting for the negotiations that might take months or years to conclude. The mass of ordinary captives had no such hope. They were put to work in the shipyards, building and repairing the galleys that would capture still more of their countrymen. They labored in the stone quarries outside the city, hewing the blocks that built the walls and mosques of Algiers. They rowed in the galleys themselves, chained to their oars on voyages that might last weeks, eating, sleeping, and relieving themselves where they sat, beaten by overseers if their stroke faltered, thrown overboard if they collapsed. The mortality rate among galley slaves was catastrophic. Contemporary estimates suggest that the average life expectancy of a man condemned to the oars was 5 to 7 years. The work was crushing, the conditions were inhuman, and disease swept through the rowing benches with terrible regularity. For the captives of Ischia and the countless other raids, the prospect of spending their remaining years in these floating hells must have seemed worse than death. Many preferred death. The sources record numerous instances of slaves deliberately provoking their overseers, sabotaging their ships, or simply throwing themselves into the sea rather than endure another day chained to an oar. Yet the system persisted because it was profitable, because it was protected, and because the Mediterranean world of the 16th and 17th centuries simply accepted slavery as a normal institution. Christians enslaved Muslims with equal enthusiasm when they had the opportunity. The Knights of Malta operated their own galleys, crewed by Muslim slaves. Spanish and Italian ships captured in battle were rowed by prisoners, just as the Corsair vessels were. The moral framework that would later make slavery seem self-evidently wrong did not yet exist, or existed only in embryonic form among a few religious reformers whose voices were largely ignored. What distinguished the Barbary system was not its moral character, but its scale, its duration, and its impact on the European imagination. For 3 centuries, the Corsairs represented an existential threat to coastal communities throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The fear they inspired shaped architecture, settlement patterns, maritime practice, and the political priorities of every state with a coastline to protect. And the captives they took produced a vast literature of suffering and redemption that became one of the dominant genres of early modern popular culture. The captivity narrative emerged as a literary form in direct response to the Barbary raids. Survivors who were ransomed or escaped wrote accounts of their experiences, sometimes decades after the fact, that were published, translated, and read throughout Europe. These narratives served multiple purposes simultaneously. They were adventure stories, full of exotic settings and dramatic escapes. They were religious texts, framing captivity as a trial of faith and release as divine deliverance. They were political documents intended to spur governments to action against the Corsair threat. And they were fundraising appeals designed to encourage donations to the religious orders that negotiated ransoms. The most famous example of the genre is not usually classified as a captivity narrative at all. Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, spent 5 years as a slave in Algiers after his capture by Corsairs in 1575. He attempted to escape at least 4 times, and his experiences in the bagnio appear throughout his later writings, most notably in the interpolated story of the captive in the first part of Don Quixote. Cervantes' account of Algiers is remarkable for its complexity, its refusal of simple moral categories, its apparent sympathy for some of his captors, and its clear-eyed assessment of the impossible choices faced by captives under pressure to convert. That Cervantes, the greatest writer of the Spanish Golden Age, was himself a Barbary slave tells us something about the reach of the Corsair system and its integration into the ordinary experience of Mediterranean life. This was not a marginal phenomenon affecting only the unlucky and obscure. The Corsairs touched every level of society, from fishermen to princes, from peasants to the greatest literary genius of the age. The institutions that developed to cope with the crisis were equally remarkable. The religious orders dedicated to the ransom of captives, primarily the Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, became some of the most important charitable organizations in Catholic Europe. They collected donations, negotiated with Corsair authorities, and transported money and released captives across the Mediterranean in a constant shuttle diplomacy that continued for centuries. The ransoming orders faced agonizing choices about how to allocate their always insufficient funds. Do you ransom the young man who might still have a productive life ahead of him, or the old woman who is more likely to die in captivity? Do you prioritize the wealthy captive whose family has contributed generously to the order, or the poor fisherman whose release will generate no future donations? The sums involved were staggering. A single captive might be ransomed for anywhere from 50 to several hundred ducats, with prices varying based on the captive's perceived wealth, social status, skills, and likelihood of conversion. The total value extracted from Christian Europe through ransoms over the 3 centuries of Corsair dominance has been estimated at hundreds of millions of ducats, an almost unimaginable transfer of wealth from the northern to the southern shore of the Mediterranean. And the ransoms represented only a fraction of the total economic impact. The Corsair raids disrupted Mediterranean trade, forcing merchants to pay higher insurance rates, travel in convoys, and avoid certain routes entirely. Coastal regions that might otherwise have developed economically remained depopulated and poor because their inhabitants feared to work the fields or fish the waters near the sea. The military resources devoted to coastal defense, the fortress building, the galley construction, the maintenance of garrisons, all represented an enormous drain on the treasuries of Spain, Italy, and the other affected states. The strategic calculations of the European powers were shaped by the Corsair threat in ways that are often overlooked in conventional histories of the period. Spain, the dominant power of the 16th century, had to maintain a significant naval presence in the western Mediterranean, simply to protect its own coasts and maintain communications between its various possessions. The resources devoted to this defensive posture were resources that could not be deployed elsewhere, a constraint that shaped Spanish grand strategy for generations. The Ottoman Empire, for its part, found in the Corsair states a useful instrument of indirect warfare. The Barbarossas and their successors were nominally Ottoman subjects, and they contributed ships and men to Ottoman naval campaigns when required. But the empire allowed them remarkable autonomy in their day-to-day operations, collecting tribute without attempting to exercise detailed control. From the Sultan's perspective, the Corsairs were a weapon that cost nothing to maintain, that constantly weakened his enemies, and that could be disavowed when diplomatic convenience required. It was a relationship that benefited both parties, and it proved remarkably durable. The European response to this challenge was fragmented by the divisions of Christendom itself. In theory, the Corsair threat should have united the Christian powers against a common enemy. In practice, the rivalries between Spain and France, between Venice and Genoa, between Catholic and Protestant, made coordinated action nearly impossible. When major expeditions were launched, like Charles Vaur's disaster at Algiers, they were Spanish or imperial efforts that other powers watched with indifference or secret satisfaction. The French, in particular, maintained diplomatic and commercial relations with the Barbary states throughout the period, purchasing the right of passage for their own ships by allowing the Corsairs to prey unmolested on everyone else. This European disunity was not merely a failure of cooperation. It was, in some sense, a rational response to the incentive structure created by the Corsair system. For any individual Christian power, the cost of eliminating the Barbary threat would have been enormous, while the benefits would have been shared by all. Better to make a separate peace, to buy off the Corsairs with tribute and trade agreements, and to let rival powers bear the burden of their depredations. The logic was impeccable. The result was that the Corsairs survived and prospered for 300 years. By the middle of the 16th century, the system had achieved a kind of equilibrium. The Corsair states were strong enough to resist any assault that Europe was willing to mount, but not strong enough to threaten the major powers directly. The raids continued, the slave markets flourished, and the Mediterranean world adapted to a new normal in which coastal populations lived under permanent threat. Watchtowers dotted every headland from Catalonia to Calabria. Warning systems using fires and bells could spread news of a Corsair sighting across dozens of miles within hours. Entire villages were fortified, their streets designed to be defensible, their churches built like strongholds. The material remains of this fear can still be seen across the Mediterranean today. The coastal towers of southern Italy, the fortified churches of Sardinia, the defensive walls of countless island villages all testify to a centuries-long emergency that shaped the built environment as profoundly as any architectural movement. Walk along the coast of Sicily or the Balearic Islands, and you are walking through a landscape that was designed in every detail to resist an enemy who might appear at any moment from over the horizon. Hayreddin Barbarossa did not live to see the full flowering of the system he had helped create. He died in 1546, 2 years after the raid on Ischia, reportedly at his palace on the Bosphorus, surrounded by the wealth and honors of a long and successful career. He was buried in a tomb that still stands in Istanbul, visited by sailors who sought his blessing before embarking on their voyages. In death, as in life, he was venerated by the maritime community that he had done so much to build. His legacy was the Corsair civilization itself, the world of swift galleys and fortified harbors that would endure for centuries after his passing. The captains who succeeded him, Turgut Reis and Uluç Ali and Murat Reis, and dozens of others, built on foundations that he and his brother had laid. They expanded the Corsair range, refined the techniques of raiding and ransom, and confronted the great naval expeditions that Christian Europe eventually assembled against them. But they were operating within a framework that the Barbarossas had established, exploiting strategic advantages that the brothers from Lesbos had been the first to recognize and exploit. The period immediately following Barbarossa's death saw some of the most dramatic confrontations of the entire Corsair era. The campaigns of Turgut Reis, whom the Europeans called Dragut, extended Ottoman and Corsair power across the central Mediterranean. The Great Siege of Malta in 1565 pitted the Knights of St. John against a massive Ottoman and Corsair fleet in a battle that contemporaries saw as a turning point in the struggle between Cross and Crescent. And the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a combined Christian fleet shattered Ottoman naval power in the largest galley battle ever fought, seemed for a moment to promise the final defeat of the Corsair enterprise. But Lepanto proved to be far less decisive than its Christian participants believed. The Ottoman fleet had been destroyed, yes. The galleys that had carried the Sultan's banners into battle lay broken and burning across the waters of the Gulf of Patras. Perhaps 200 ships had been sunk or captured. 30,000 Ottoman and Corsair sailors and soldiers were dead. The Christian admirals, Don John of Austria, the Venetian commander Sebastiano Venier, the papal admiral Marcantonio Colonna, returned to their home ports as heroes, showered with honors, celebrated in paintings and poems and Te Deums that rang through every cathedral in Catholic Europe. Medallions were struck. Feast days were declared. It seemed in that autumn of 1571 that the back of Muslim sea power had been broken forever. It had not. Within a year, the Ottoman shipyards had replaced the lost fleet. Within 2 years, Uluç Ali, the Calabrian-born renegade who had escaped Lepanto with the Corsair squadron largely intact, had rebuilt the naval infrastructure of the western Mediterranean. Within 5 years, the strategic situation had returned almost precisely to its pre-Lepanto configuration. Venice, exhausted by the war, made a separate peace with the Ottomans in 1573, ceding Cyprus and paying an indemnity. Spain, distracted by rebellions in the Netherlands and financial crises at home, turned its attention elsewhere. The Holy League that had assembled the Lepanto fleet dissolved into the same pattern of competitive self-interest that had characterized European policy toward the Corsairs for decades. The Corsair states had barely been touched. This was, in some ways, the central fact that the celebrants of Lepanto failed to grasp. The battle had been fought in the eastern Mediterranean against the Ottoman imperial fleet, but the Corsair enterprise was centered in the western Mediterranean, operating from Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli, and the Corsair squadrons had played only a supporting role in the great engagement. Uluç Ali had commanded the Corsair contingent at Lepanto, and he had fought with his characteristic skill, breaking through the Christian left wing before being forced to withdraw when the center collapsed. He escaped with perhaps 30 ships and made his way back to Constantinople, where the Sultan rewarded his competence with command of the entire Ottoman navy and the title of Kılıç Ali Pasha, Ali of the Sword. It was Uluç Ali who would rebuild what Lepanto had destroyed, and his story illuminates the strange pathways by which men became corsairs in this period. He had been born Giovanni Dionigi Galeni, probably in 1519, in a small village in Calabria, the toe of the Italian boot. The sources disagree on whether he was a fisherman, a sailor, or something else entirely, but they agree that he was captured by corsairs as a young man and brought to Algiers in chains. For years he labored as a slave, probably as an oarsman in the corsair galleys, experiencing from below the same system that he would later command from above. At some point, the date is uncertain, he converted to Islam and joined the Corsair Brotherhood. The reasons are lost to us. Perhaps he was beaten into conversion. Perhaps he calculated that changing his faith was the only path out of the rowing benches. Perhaps, as some later accounts suggest, he genuinely found something in Islam that his Christianity had not provided. The question of why men converted is one of the most difficult in this entire history, because the converts themselves almost never left testimony explaining their choice. What we know is that Uluç Ali rose with extraordinary speed through the corsair ranks. He became a reis, then a captain of multiple ships, then a commander of squadrons. By the 1560s, he was one of the most feared corsair leaders in the Mediterranean, distinguished by his tactical skill and his willingness to take risks that other captains avoided. When Turgut Reis died at the siege of Malta in 1565, killed by a cannonball that struck near his position during the bombardment of Fort St. Elmo, Uluç Ali was appointed to succeed him as Beylerbey of Algiers. The former Calabrian fisherman now ruled the greatest corsair state in the Mediterranean. His career after Lepanto demonstrated the resilience of the system that the Barbarossas had built. Appointed Capudan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, Uluç Ali supervised the construction of an entirely new navy in the shipyards of Constantinople. The sources claim that within 6 months, the Ottomans had launched over 150 new galleys. Within a year, the fleet was larger than it had been before the battle. This was not magic, though it seemed so to European observers. It was industrial capacity. The Ottoman Empire possessed vast forests of shipbuilding timber, particularly in Anatolia, and the administrative apparatus to mobilize labor and materials on an enormous scale. What Lepanto had destroyed was wood and metal and men. All of these could be replaced. What Lepanto had not destroyed was knowledge, the accumulated expertise of generations of Corsair and Ottoman seamen in the techniques of galley warfare, navigation, and raid tactics. This knowledge resided in the minds of the men who had survived the battle, and it was this knowledge that made the post-Lepanto recovery possible. Uluç Ali brought back to Constantinople not just his 30 ships, but his crews, his officers, and his understanding of how the Corsair system functioned. He spent the decade after Lepanto rebuilding the Ottoman navy and continuing the pattern of raid and counter-raid that had characterized the previous century. He also continued to be a Corsair. Even as Grand Admiral, Uluç Ali led raiding expeditions against Christian shipping and coastal settlements. The distinction between pirate and admiral, between privateer and servant of the state, remained as blurred as it had been since Oris Barbarossa first offered Algiers to the Sultan. In 1574, just 3 years after the supposedly decisive Christian victory, Uluç Ali recaptured Tunis from Spanish control. The city had changed hands several times over the previous decades, but this conquest proved permanent. Tunis would remain under Ottoman and Corsair control until the 19th century. Uluç Ali died in 1587, probably in Constantinople, having spent nearly 50 years in the Corsair enterprise, first as its victim, then as one of its greatest practitioners. His life was an extreme example of the social mobility that the Corsair system offered to those willing to cross the boundary between faiths. A peasant boy from Calabria became the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Empire. This was not supposed to be possible in a world of fixed hierarchies and hereditary privilege. But the Corsair world operated by different rules, and those rules rewarded competence above all else. The generation that followed Uluç Ali saw the Corsair enterprise reach what may have been its peak of efficiency and reach. The late 16th and early 17th centuries witnessed raids of unprecedented ambition and audacity. Corsair squadrons appeared in waters that European sailors had considered safe for centuries. The Atlantic coast of Portugal and Spain, the approaches to the English Channel, the North Sea, even, astonishingly, the waters of the far North Atlantic. The raid on Iceland in 1627 remains one of the most striking examples of Corsair reach. It was led by a Dutch renegade named Jan Janzoen, who had converted to Islam and taken the name Murat Reis the Younger, adopting the name of an earlier famous Corsair in the manner that successful raid captains often did. Janzoen had been born in Haarlem around 1570, had served as a privateer for the Dutch during their revolt against Spain, and had at some point crossed over to the Corsair side. By the 1620s, he was operating out of the new Corsair base of Salé in Morocco, and he commanded a small fleet of heavily armed sailing ships, a newer type of vessel that was beginning to supplement the traditional galleys. The Iceland expedition was a voyage of over 2,000 miles across some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Janzun's squadron, the sources disagree on its exact size, but perhaps 3 to 5 ships, sailed north past Ireland, past Scotland, past the Faroe Islands, into waters where no corsair had ever ventured. They arrived off the coast of Iceland in June, when the subarctic summer provided nearly continuous daylight and relatively calm seas. The Icelanders had no conception of what was about to happen to them. Iceland in 1627 was a remote and impoverished Danish colony, its population perhaps 50,000 souls scattered across a landscape of volcanic rock and glacier. The island had no military forces to speak of, no fortifications, no warning systems of the kind that had developed across the Mediterranean. When the corsair ships appeared off the coast, the local population was utterly unprepared. The raids lasted several weeks and struck multiple communities. The corsairs targeted the eastern coast of Iceland, attacking the trading posts and fishing villages where they could find both plunder and captives. They killed those who resisted and took nearly 400 Icelanders prisoner, men, women, and children who were loaded into the ship's holds for the long voyage back to North Africa. The captives' journey south would have taken weeks, perhaps months. We can only imagine what those weeks must have been like. The cramped conditions below decks, the unfamiliar language of their captors, the gradual realization that everything they had known was gone forever. When they finally arrived in Algiers or Salé, they were sold in the slave markets like any other captives, dispersed into the vast labor pool that powered the corsair economy. Some of the Icelandic captives were eventually ransomed. In 1636, nearly a decade after the raid, the Danish crown negotiated the release of a small number of survivors. A minister named Olafur Egilson, who had been captured along with his family, eventually made his way back to Iceland and wrote an account of his captivity that survives to this day. One of the few first-person narratives we have from the victims of corsair raids. He described the journey south, the slave markets, the years of waiting, and the complex negotiations that finally secured his freedom. His wife and children were not ransomed with him. Some he eventually recovered, others he never saw again. The Iceland raid was not militarily significant. It did not reshape the balance of power in the Mediterranean or alter the strategic position of any major state, but it demonstrated something important about the corsair enterprise at its peak. Its reach was limited only by the ambition and skill of individual captains. If a renegade Dutchman sailing from Morocco could raid Iceland, then no coastal community in the Atlantic world was truly safe. The psychological impact of this realization extended far beyond the actual numbers of those killed or captured. The early 17th century also saw the corsairs make significant incursions along the coasts of England and Ireland. The most famous of these raids struck the village of Baltimore in County Cork in 1631, just 4 years after the Iceland expedition. The attack was led by another Murat race, probably the same Jan Jansun, though the sources are not entirely clear, and it resulted in the capture of over 100 villagers, most of them English settlers who had established themselves in the area only a generation earlier. The Baltimore raid traumatized the English-speaking world in ways that resonated for centuries. It occurred not in some distant Mediterranean fishing village, but in territory that England claimed and supposedly protected. The captives included women and children, and the image of Christian innocents being dragged away into Moorish slavery proved irresistible to propagandists, playwrights, and preachers. Pamphlets describing the raid circulated throughout England and Ireland. Sermons warned that God was punishing English sin by allowing the infidel to strike so close to home. The event became a symbol of vulnerability and eventually a justification for naval expansion. Only 3 of the Baltimore captives are known to have ever returned. The others disappeared into the slave markets of North Africa, their fates unknown. Perhaps some were ransomed by families we have no record of. Perhaps some converted and made lives for themselves in Algiers or Tunis. Perhaps some died in the galleys or the quarries or the plague epidemics that periodically swept through the bagnios. The historical record simply does not contain enough information to trace them. They became part of the vast anonymous mass of captives who passed through the corsair system and vanished from European documentation. This is, perhaps, the moment to consider what that experience, the experience of capture, transport, sale, and enslavement, actually meant in human terms. The sources that survive are almost entirely written from the outside. The accounts of ransomed captives, the records of religious orders who negotiated releases, the propaganda of Christian polemicists, the legal documents of North African courts. The interior experience of the enslaved, what they thought, what they felt, how they understood what was happening to them, is almost entirely lost. What we can reconstruct is the process. The raid itself was typically swift and brutal. Corsair tactics favored surprise above all else. Ships approached coastal settlements at night or appeared suddenly from behind headlands, giving the inhabitants as little warning as possible. The Corsairs would land in small boats, fan out through the village, and begin the work of capture and collection. Those who resisted were killed. Those who fled were pursued, though the Corsairs generally did not waste time chasing individuals into difficult terrain. The goal was to gather as many captives as possible in the shortest time and return to the ships before any organized defense could materialize. The captives were typically bound and herded into groups, then transported to the waiting ships. Children were sometimes separated from parents, husbands from wives. The Corsairs knew the value of their cargo and generally tried to keep captives alive and undamaged, but the process was not gentle. Those who could not keep up might be killed or abandoned. Those who caused trouble might be beaten or made examples of. The voyage to North Africa could last anywhere from a few days to several weeks, depending on wind, weather, and the distance involved. Captives were typically held below decks in cramped and unsanitary conditions. Food and water were limited. Disease spread easily. Some captives died before ever reaching the slave markets. Their bodies were thrown overboard. Upon arrival in Algiers, Tunis, or one of the other Corsair ports, the captives were taken to the slave markets. These were public affairs, held in designated locations where potential buyers could examine the merchandise. Captives were displayed, their physical condition assessed, their skills and backgrounds investigated. A skilled craftsman might fetch a higher price than an unskilled laborer. A young woman might be valued differently than an elderly man. Children were sold separately or with their mothers, depending on the preferences of buyers. The slave market of Algiers was one of the largest and most active in the Mediterranean world. Contemporary accounts describe a vast plaza where hundreds of captives might be sold on a single day. Buyers included wealthy Corsair captains looking for household servants, ship's captains seeking oarsmen, workshop owners needing labor, and agents purchasing captives on behalf of clients in the interior. The prices varied enormously, depending on the perceived value of the individual captive and the supply available at any given time. After sale, a captive's fate depended entirely on who had purchased them and for what purpose. The most dangerous assignment was the galleys. Galley oarsmen led brutal lives of constant physical labor, chained to their benches, exposed to weather and combat, fed the minimum necessary to keep them rowing. Life expectancy in the galleys was short. Those who survived for years often did so with permanent damage to their bodies, backs bent, hands calloused into permanent grips around the oar handles, lungs damaged by the effort of rowing for hours at a time. Other captives were assigned to labor gangs that worked in quarries, construction sites, or agricultural estates. This work was also brutal, though perhaps somewhat less deadly than the galleys. The bagnios, the great slave prisons of Algiers, held thousands of captives who were assigned to various forms of labor during the day and returned to the prison at night. The bagnios were hierarchical institutions with their own internal economies. Captives with resources could purchase better food, better sleeping arrangements, relative freedom of movement within the prison. Those without resources endured harsher conditions. Some captives were purchased for household service, and their experiences varied enormously depending on the nature of their owners. A skilled captive might serve as a secretary, a translator, an artisan producing goods for his owner's profit. Some household servants lived in relative comfort, particularly if they possessed skills that their owners valued. Others experienced cruelty and exploitation. The sources provide examples of both extremes, and some captives converted. The phenomenon of conversion of renegadism, as the Europeans called it, was one of the most troubling aspects of the Corsair system for Christian observers. It was not supposed to happen. Christianity was supposed to be the true faith, and Muslims were supposed to be infidels, whom any good Christian would resist to the death. Yet, thousands of European captives, faced with the choice between a lifetime of slavery and conversion to Islam, chose conversion. And some of them, having converted, went on to become corsairs themselves, raiding the same coasts they had once called home, capturing the same people who had once been their neighbors. The reasons for conversion were complex and varied. Some converts were genuinely persuaded by Islamic teaching. Some were coerced through violence or the threat of it. Many were motivated by the practical advantages that conversion offered: freedom from slavery, the opportunity to work and earn money, the possibility of rising through corsair ranks to positions of wealth and power. For a young man with no prospects in Christian Europe, conversion might represent not degradation, but opportunity, a chance at a life that his birth would never have permitted in his homeland. The Christian authorities understood this, and it terrified them. The ransom orders, the Trinitarians, the Mercedarians, worked not only to free captives, but to prevent conversions. They prioritized the ransom of those thought most likely to convert: young men, women, children. They preached to the captives in the barrios, trying to maintain their faith under conditions of extreme pressure. They celebrated those who resisted conversion even unto death as martyrs, and condemned those who converted as apostates, worse than the Muslims themselves. But the conversions continued. The European-born corsair captain, the renegade, became one of the most distinctive figures of the corsair world. Men like Uluç Ali and Can Canzun demonstrated that the highest levels of corsair society were open to those willing to cross the religious boundary. They were not unique. The historical records contain the names of hundreds of renegade captains who commanded corsair vessels: Englishmen, Dutchmen, Frenchmen, Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese. Some achieved fame and power. Others lived and died as minor figures, known only from passing references in captured documents or court records. The renegades occupied an impossible position in the Christian imagination. They were traitors to their faith and their people, yet they were also proof that the corsair world offered something that Christian Europe did not: the possibility of reinvention. A man could cross the sea, change his name, change his religion, and become someone entirely new. The rigid hierarchies of European society did not apply in the corsair ports. What mattered was competence. Could you command a ship? Could you lead a raid? Could you bring back captives and plunder? This meritocratic dimension of the corsair world was both real and limited. Not everyone could rise to become a reis, regardless of their skills. The corsair cities had their own hierarchies, their own prejudices, their own barriers to advancement. But compared to the world the renegades had left behind, the corsair ports offered genuine mobility. A peasant's son could become wealthy. A slave could become a captain. A fisherman from Calabria could become Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet. The 17th century saw the corsair enterprise adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The great galley battles of the 16th century gave way to a more diffuse pattern of raiding and commerce warfare. The corsairs adopted new ship designs, sail-powered vessels that could operate in the Atlantic as well as the Mediterranean, without abandoning the traditional galleys that remained effective for certain purposes. They continued to capture ships and people, to operate the slave markets, to collect ransom and tribute. But the balance of power was slowly shifting. European naval technology was improving. The great sailing warships of the late 17th and 18th centuries were increasingly capable of projecting force into waters that the corsairs had once dominated. The English, the French, the Dutch, and eventually the Americans built navies that could challenge corsair squadrons on something approaching equal terms. The treaties that the European powers signed with the corsair states increasingly favored the Europeans, exempting their shipping from attack in exchange for payments that were really a form of tribute, though the Europeans preferred not to call it that. The corsair states also faced internal challenges. The Ottoman Empire, which had provided the political framework within which the corsair enterprise operated, was entering its long period of relative decline. The Janissary Corps, that had once provided the military backbone of the regencies, became increasingly unruly, sometimes overthrowing the appointed governors and installing their own candidates. The economic model that had sustained the Corsairs, the capture and sale of human beings, faced increasing pressure as the volume of ransomable captives declined and the costs of maintaining the fleet rose. And yet, the raids continued. The raids continued, even as the world that had made them possible was slowly dissolving. Through the 18th century, Corsair galleys still slipped out of Algiers harbor in the hours before dawn, their crews bent over the oars, their captains scanning the horizon for sail. They still took ships, they still took people. But the nature of their victims had changed. Where once the Corsairs had preyed on the rich commerce of Spain, Venice, and Genoa, they now increasingly targeted the shipping of smaller nations, the Danes, the Swedes, the Neapolitans, the young American Republic, states that could not afford the naval power to punish the attacks or the diplomatic leverage to negotiate immunity. The great powers had purchased their safety. The small ones had not. This shift revealed something essential about the Corsair enterprise that had always been true but was now impossible to ignore. It was, at its heart, a protection racket elevated to the level of international relations. The Corsair states sold immunity from their own violence. A nation that paid tribute received passes for its ships, documents that Corsair captains were supposed to respect. A nation that refused to pay, or that could not afford to pay, saw its merchants and sailors captured, its commerce disrupted, its citizens sold in the markets of Algiers. The system was naked extortion dressed in the language of diplomacy, and it worked because the Corsairs maintained just enough naval capability to make the threat credible, while the European powers found it cheaper to pay than to fight. The payments took various forms. Some were straightforward cash tribute, delivered in regular installments by European consuls resident in the Corsair capitals. Others were presents, guns, gunpowder, ship timber, naval stores, delivered at the accession of a new ruler or the signing of a new treaty. Still others were payments for the ransom of specific captives, negotiated case by case through the elaborate machinery that had developed over centuries. The sums were not trivial. In the late 18th century, the United States, a new nation with a struggling treasury, found itself paying nearly 10% of its annual federal revenue in tribute and ransom to the Barbary states. The great powers paid proportionally less, but still paid regularly, year after year, decade after decade. The consuls who lived in Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli occupied one of the strangest diplomatic positions in the world. They were representatives of Christian powers living in Muslim states whose primary industry was the capture and enslavement of Christians. They negotiated ransom payments for their countrymen while living in palaces within sight of the bagnios, where those countrymen were imprisoned. They attended official functions at the courts of the Deys and Beys, while knowing that their hosts had built their fortunes on human misery. The consul's life was a constant navigation between diplomatic necessity and moral compromise, a balancing act that some performed with cynicism and others with genuine anguish. The reports these consuls sent home provide some of the most detailed descriptions of the Corsair states in their final century. They describe the audiences with the Dey of Algiers, the unpredictable despot who ruled the city, sometimes for decades, sometimes for days before being overthrown and killed by his own janissaries. They describe the harbor, still crowded with ships, though fewer now than in the Golden Age. They describe the bagnios, still operating, still full of captives awaiting ransom or death, or the slow, grinding labor that wore men down until they were worth nothing to anyone. They describe the markets, the mosques, the palaces of the wealthy captains, the narrow streets where a wrong turn could lead a Christian into danger. And they describe, almost always, the sense of a world living on borrowed time, a system that continued to function through inertia and habit even as the forces that would destroy it gathered strength. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that followed disrupted the fragile equilibrium of the Mediterranean. For 2 decades, from 1792 to 1815, European navies were too busy fighting each other to pay much attention to the Corsairs. The great powers withdrew their Mediterranean squadrons, leaving the seas open to raiders who suddenly found themselves operating in a target-rich environment with minimal opposition. Corsair activity actually increased during this period, a late flowering before the final decline. Ships flying neutral flags, American, Swedish, Danish, became frequent victims as the Corsairs exploited the chaos of the European wars. But the wars also demonstrated something that would prove fatal to the Corsair enterprise. What happened when a major European power decided that paying tribute was no longer acceptable? Britain, whose navy grew to overwhelming dominance during the Napoleonic period, began to take a harder line. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, which reorganized Europe after Napoleon's defeat, included discussions of suppressing the Barbary Corsairs once and for all. The representatives of the great powers, fresh from defeating the most powerful military force Europe had seen in centuries, found it absurd that they should continue paying tribute to what they viewed as petty pirate states. The old equilibrium, Corsairs raid, Europeans pay, was no longer politically sustainable. The first decisive blow came in 1816, when a combined British and Dutch fleet under Lord Exmouth bombarded Algiers. The attack was ostensibly in response to the DI's massacre of Corsican, Sicilian, and Sardinian coral fishermen who had been promised protection. But the underlying cause was simpler. Britain had decided that the Corsair system was an embarrassment incompatible with its post-war vision of the Mediterranean. The bombardment was devastating. Over the course of several hours, the Anglo-Dutch fleet poured thousands of shells into the harbor fortifications, the arsenal, and the Corsair fleet itself. When the smoke cleared, the DI's navy had been shattered, and he was forced to sign a treaty freeing Christian slaves and promising to end the practice of enslaving Christians entirely. The promise was not kept. Within months of the fleet's departure, the Corsairs were rebuilding, and within years they were raiding again, though more cautiously, targeting ships from nations too weak to retaliate. But the bombardment had demonstrated something important. The Corsair states could be broken by any power willing to commit sufficient force. The mystique of invincibility, carefully cultivated over 3 centuries, had been shattered. The Corsairs were not unconquerable. They were simply unconquered, preserved by the indifference and distraction of the powers that could have destroyed them at any time. The final act came in 1830, and it came from France. The immediate cause was trivial: a dispute over debts, a diplomatic slight, a Dey who struck the French consul with a fly whisk during a heated argument, but the trivial cause masked deeper motives. France, governed by the restored Bourbon monarchy, was facing internal political turmoil. King Charles VI saw conquest in North Africa as a way to bolster his prestige and distract from domestic problems. An expeditionary force of nearly 40,000 men embarked from Toulon in May, landed on the Algerian coast in June, and captured Algiers itself in July. The Dey surrendered, the treasury was looted, the Corsair fleet was destroyed, and 3 centuries of Corsair sovereignty came to an end in a matter of weeks. The conquest was far easier than anyone had expected. The Corsair military, which had terrorized the Mediterranean for generations, crumbled almost immediately when confronted with a modern European army. The Janissary Corps that had once been the terror of Christian captives proved useless against disciplined infantry supported by artillery. The fortifications that had repelled so many earlier attacks fell in days. The Dey himself fled into exile with whatever wealth he could carry, ending a line of rulers that stretched back to the brothers Barbarossa. What followed the conquest was not liberation, but replacement. One form of domination giving way to another. France did not free Algeria. France colonized Algeria. The indigenous population, Arab, Berber, Moor, exchanged the rule of the Ottoman-backed Deys for the rule of French colonial administrators. The slave markets closed, but the native population found themselves reduced to second-class status in their own land, their property seized, their culture suppressed, their political rights non-existent. The system of human bondage that had defined the Corsair economy was replaced by a system of colonial extraction that would last until 1962, when Algeria finally won its independence through a brutal war that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The other Corsair states fell in various ways. Tunis and Tripoli avoided outright conquest for a time by submitting to European demands, signing treaties that ended their raiding and made them increasingly subject to European economic and political influence. They became, in effect, client states, their independence nominal, their rulers dependent on European goodwill. When the European powers finally absorbed them, Tunisia became a French protectorate in 1881, Libya an Italian colony in 1911. The transition was almost anticlimactic. The Corsair era had been over for decades, only the political forms remained, and those disappeared in their turn. But we should pause here, in this moment of ending, and ask what the Corsair phenomenon actually meant, not to the Europeans who feared it and eventually destroyed it, but to the people who lived it. The story as told from the European perspective is straightforward. Pirates terrorized Christian shipping, enslaved innocent people, and were eventually suppressed by the progress of European civilization. This narrative is not wrong, exactly, but it is radically incomplete. It treats the Corsairs as villains in a European story rather than as actors in their own. From the perspective of the Corsair cities themselves, the enterprise looked very different. The Corsairs saw themselves as warriors of the faith, conducting legitimate warfare against the enemies of Islam. The enslavement of Christians was, in their view, no different from, and indeed more humane than, the enslavement of Africans that Europeans practiced on an industrial scale across the Atlantic. The Corsair captains were not pirates, but privateers, operating under letters of marque from legitimate sovereign authorities. The Ottoman Sultan was the commander of the faithful, the successor to the Prophet, and attacks on Christian shipping were as much an act of holy war as the Crusades had been for the other side. This perspective does not excuse the suffering of the captives in the bagnios, but it complicates the simple moral framework that European sources impose. The Mediterranean of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries was a theater of religious war in which both sides practiced slavery. Both sides conducted raids on civilian populations, and both sides believed themselves to be serving God. The Knights of Malta enslaved Muslim captives in numbers that rivaled the bagnios of Algiers. Spanish and Italian coastal communities were fortified against Corsair raids, but North African coastal communities were fortified against Christian raids with equal reason. The traffic in human beings flowed in both directions across the religious boundary, though the volume was probably greater from north to south than from south to north. The Corsair cities were also in their way remarkable achievements. Algiers at its height was a city of over 100,000 people, larger than most European capitals, a cosmopolitan center where Turkish, Arabic, Berber, and half a dozen European languages could be heard in the streets. The great mosques and palaces of the Corsair captains represented an architecture of genuine sophistication, blending Ottoman, Moorish, and local traditions. The legal and political institutions that governed the Corsair states were complex and functional, capable of maintaining order, resolving disputes, and organizing collective enterprises over centuries. Whatever else they were, the Corsair states were states, not merely pirate dens. The renegades who converted and joined the Corsairs further complicate any simple moral accounting. These men, and they were almost entirely men, made a choice that European society condemned as the ultimate betrayal. They abandoned their faith, their families, their identities. In the eyes of the church, they had damned their souls for temporal advantage. In the eyes of their former countrymen, they were worse than the Muslims themselves, traitors who had gone over to the enemy. The ransom orders that worked to free captives often refused to pay for renegades, leaving them to their fate. And yet the renegades kept coming. Generation after generation, European men crossed the line, took Muslim names, and built new lives in the Corsair ports. Some were coerced, circumcised by force after capture, and given no choice but to accept their new identity. But many converted voluntarily, calculating that life as a free Muslim in Algiers was preferable to life as a peasant in Calabria or a seaman in Bristol. The Corsair world offered them something that Christian Europe did not, the chance to become something other than what their birth had made them. Jan Soon, the Dutchman who became Murat Reis, is perhaps the most extreme example, but he was not alone. The archives of the Corsair states, such as they survive, are full of names that betray European origin. Giovanni become Yusuf, Pedro become Ali, Thomas become Hassan. These men commanded ships, owned property, married local women, and raised children who were fully integrated into the Corsair world. Their descendants, bearing Muslim names and speaking Arabic or Turkish, had no memory of the European past that their fathers had abandoned. The Christian origins of these families were erased within a generation or two, absorbed into the hybrid civilization of the Corsair coast. The question of what to call these people, pirates, privateers, corsairs, holy warriors, matters less than understanding the system they operated within. They were participants in a centuries-long conflict between Christianity and Islam that played out across the Mediterranean basin, a conflict in which the taking of captives and the extraction of ransom were normal features of warfare. They were also participants in a commercial enterprise that treated human beings as commodities, a practice that Europeans of the same era conducted on a vastly larger scale in the Atlantic slave trade. They were, in short, people of their time, operating according to the moral logic of their time, which we can condemn, but should not pretend to be unable to understand. The captives in the Banios present the hardest challenge to this moral complexity. Whatever we say about the Corsairs as warriors or businessmen, the people chained in the slave prisons of Algiers were suffering human beings. The records that survive, from released captives, from ransom negotiations, from the reports of religious orders, describe conditions of genuine brutality. The labor was hard, the food was poor, the punishments were severe. Captives died of disease, of exhaustion, of abuse. Those who resisted were tortured. Those who attempted escape were executed. The Banio was not a metaphor. It was a concrete place where real people lived and died in conditions of unfreedom. But even here, the picture is complicated. Some captives, particularly those with valuable skills, lived in relatively comfortable conditions. Surgeons, translators, craftsmen with needed expertise could find themselves housed decently, fed adequately, even earning wages of a sort while they awaited ransom. The patrons who bought slaves from the market had an economic incentive to keep their property alive and functional. The worst conditions were reserved for the common laborers, the rowers in the galleys, the men breaking rocks in the quarries, those whose only value was their muscle power, easily replaced when they wore out. The women captives, though fewer in number, faced their own particular horrors. Some were sold into households as domestic servants, where their treatment depended entirely on the character of their owners. Others were sold into concubinage, their bodies becoming property in the most intimate sense. The ransom orders that worked to free captives prioritized women and children, precisely because their fate was assumed to be worse than that of men. The silence of the archives on the experiences of these women is itself a kind of testimony. Their stories were too shameful to record, too painful to remember, too common to remark upon. And behind all of this was the economic logic that made the whole system function. The Corsair enterprise was not irrational cruelty. It was a business conducted according to principles that any merchant would recognize. The ships were capital investments that needed to generate returns. The captains were entrepreneurs who shared profits with their crews, according to established formulas. The slave markets were exactly that, markets where prices were set by supply and demand, where buyers and sellers negotiated over human merchandise as they would over any other commodity. The bagnios were assets managed by the state, their populations put to work on public projects or rented out to private employers. The ransom system was a sophisticated mechanism for extracting value from captives whose labor was worth less than their freedom price. This economic rationality makes the Corsair enterprise neither better nor worse morally. Enslaving people efficiently is not superior to enslaving them inefficiently, but it does help explain how the system persisted for so long. The Corsair states worked, in the narrow sense that they generated revenue, maintained political stability, and defended themselves against external threats. They provided livelihoods for thousands of sailors, soldiers, merchants, and craftsmen. They created wealth that built mosques and palaces and sustained populations. They were, in economic terms, successful, and their success was built on the systematic commodification of human beings. The end of the Corsair era did not end slavery in the Mediterranean, it transformed it. The European powers that suppressed the Corsairs were simultaneously conducting slave trades of their own on vastly larger scales. The same France that conquered Algiers in 1830 had only abolished slavery in its Caribbean colonies in 1794, had reimposed it under Napoleon in 1802, and would not abolish it definitively until 1848. The same Britain that bombarded Algiers in 1816 was still profiting indirectly from slave-produced goods and would continue to do so for decades. The moral high ground from which Europeans condemned the Barbary Corsairs was built on foundations that would not bear close examination. None of this excuses the Corsairs or minimizes the suffering of their victims, but it should make us cautious about treating the Corsair era as a simple story of good versus evil, of civilization triumphing over barbarism. The Mediterranean of those centuries was a contested space where multiple forms of violence and exploitation operated simultaneously, where the line between legitimate warfare and piracy was drawn by the victors, and where the freedom of some was purchased with the bondage of others. The Corsairs were part of this world, not an aberration from it. They played by the rules of their time, and they lost when those rules changed. What remains of the Corsair world today is mostly stone. The watchtowers that still dot the coastlines of southern Europe, built to warn of approaching raiders, have become tourist attractions and scenic viewpoints. The fortifications of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli have been partially restored, partially demolished, partially absorbed into modern cities that have grown up around them. The bagnios are gone, their locations known only to historians. The shipyards that once built the swift galleys of the Corsair fleet are silent. The markets where human beings were bought and sold are now ordinary commercial spaces, their terrible histories unmarked and largely forgotten. The forgetting is itself a kind of violence, a second erasure visited upon those who suffered the first. When a city paves over its slave market and builds a cafe in its place, when a harbor that once launched 1,000 raiding galleys becomes a marina for pleasure boats, when the cells of a bagnio are filled with rubble and then with concrete, and then with the foundations of an apartment building, something is lost that can never be recovered. Not just the physical evidence, though that matters, but the testimony of the space itself, the worn stone where captives knelt, the iron rings where chains were fastened, the high windows through which men and women looked out at a sky they might never see as free people again. These places knew things, and now they are silent. But some traces remain. In the British National Archives, there are letters written by captives in Algiers to their families in England, begging for ransom money. The handwriting varies from the educated script of a merchant captain to the labored letters of a fisherman who barely knew how to hold a pen. Some of these letters are stained, whether with seawater or tears or the simple grime of centuries in storage. We cannot know. They ask for specific sums. They describe conditions. They promise to repay every penny if only someone, anyone, will send the money that will bring them home. Many of these letters went unanswered. We know this because the captives who wrote them never returned. Their names appear in no subsequent records. They vanished into the machinery of Mediterranean slavery and were never seen again. In the archives of the Trinitarian Order, the religious brothers who dedicated themselves to ransoming Christian captives, there are account books that record transactions with unsettling precision. So many ducats for Juan Fernandez, sailor, age 42, held in Algiers for 6 years. So many ducats for Maria of Valencia, captured in a coastal raid at age 19, ransomed at age 27. The numbers are not large by the standards of the time. A skilled worker might earn such a sum in a few years of labor. But for fishing families who lived at the edge of subsistence, for peasant villages where coin money was scarce, for the countless thousands whose relatives could not raise the ransom, these numbers represented an impossible barrier between captivity and freedom. The Trinitarians kept records of their voyages to the Corsair ports. They described the negotiations, the inspections of captives, the haggling over prices. They described the moment of redemption, the captive led forward, the coins counted out, the formal transfer of ownership from Muslim master to Christian redeemer. They described the journey home, the ships full of men and women who had not expected to survive, the masses of thanksgiving said in cathedral churches when the ransomed captives finally set foot on Christian soil. These records are invaluable to historians. They are also, in their calm enumeration of human misery, almost unbearable to read. Not everyone could be ransomed. The Trinitarians and their counterpart orders, the Mercedarians and others, operated on limited budgets. They had to make choices. A young man in good health who could be returned to productive labor was a better investment than an elderly woman who would need support for the rest of her life. A captive with wealthy relatives who might reimburse the order was more attractive than an orphan with no connections. A skilled craftsman who could serve the church was worth more than an illiterate laborer. The mathematics of mercy was cold, but it was mathematics nonetheless. And for every captive whose name appears in the ransom records, there were dozens whose names appear nowhere at all, who lived and died in North Africa without ever knowing whether anyone in their homeland even remembered they existed. The physical evidence is scattered across 3 continents. In the coastal villages of southern Spain, you can still find the ruins of watchtowers spaced at intervals calculated to allow signal fires to be seen from one to the next, a chain of warning beacons that could transmit news of an approaching Corsair fleet from the sea to the interior in a matter of hours. In the churches of these same villages, you can find ex voto paintings, folk art created by grateful survivors to thank the Virgin Mary or a patron saint for their deliverance from captivity. These paintings show Corsair ships, captives in chains, miraculous interventions. They are crude by academic standards, but they carry the weight of genuine experience. Someone who had been there painted these images. Someone who remembered the terror and the relief created these small monuments to survival. In Algiers itself, the old city, the Kasbah, still stands, though much diminished from its former glory. The narrow winding streets that once led from the harbor to the Palace of the Dey still climb the steep hillside in their ancient patterns. Some of the great houses built by successful Reis can still be identified, their courtyards now subdivided into apartments, their fountains dry, their marble floors covered with the detritus of centuries. The harbor where the Corsair fleet once anchored is now a modern commercial port. The breakwater that protected the galleys from storms was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries. Nothing visible remains of the original structure that Hayreddin Barbarossa constructed in the 1530s. The Bagnio of the Dey, the largest of the slave prisons, stood in the lower part of the city near the harbor. It was demolished in the 19th century. The site is now occupied by other buildings. A visitor today would find no marker, no memorial, no indication that this was once a place where thousands of human beings were held in conditions of extreme misery. The erasure is complete, but the human traces cannot be so easily erased. In the genetic record of coastal Mediterranean populations, there are traces of admixture that can only be explained by the movement of people across the sea in both directions. Europeans brought to North Africa as slaves, North Africans brought to Europe in the same capacity. The boundaries that seemed so firm on maps of the period were permeable in ways that the official narratives of religious warfare could never acknowledge. Children were born in the Bagnios. Some survived. Their descendants are still among us, carrying in their blood the evidence of encounters that no archive recorded. In the linguistic record, there are traces of contact that scholarship is only beginning to understand. The lingua franca of the Mediterranean, that pidgin language that allowed communication across linguistic boundaries, carried vocabulary from Arabic, Turkish, Spanish, Italian, and other languages in combinations that reflected the realities of life in Corsair ports. Some of this vocabulary survives in modern dialects, some of it has been lost. But for 3 centuries, there existed a common language of the sea that was neither European nor African, neither Christian nor Muslim, but something genuinely hybrid, a linguistic testimony to the fact that people who officially regarded each other as mortal enemies were in constant and intimate contact. And in the cultural memory of the peoples involved, there are stories that history books rarely capture. In coastal villages of southern Italy, there are still family traditions about ancestors who were taken by the Corsairs and never returned. In North African families, there are traditions about ancestors who converted and became famous reis, or about European women who entered harems and bore children who rose to prominence. These oral traditions are not always historically accurate. They have been shaped by centuries of retelling, embellished and simplified, and sometimes outright invented. But they testify to the enduring impact of the Corsair era on the peoples who lived through it. The raids were not abstract historical events. They happened to specific people in specific places, and the memory of that happening was passed down through generations. The question that historians have struggled with for decades is how to assess the moral weight of the Corsair enterprise in comparison to other forms of slavery that operated simultaneously. The transatlantic slave trade, which reached its peak in the same centuries that the Barbary Corsairs flourished, transported approximately 12.5 million Africans to the Americas under conditions of extraordinary brutality. The scale is not comparable. The transatlantic trade was larger by an order of magnitude, more systematic, more deadly in transit, and more consequential in its long-term effects. The plantation slavery that awaited survivors of the Middle Passage was, in many respects, more severe than the slavery practiced in North Africa, where manumission was common. Legal protections for slaves existed in Islamic law, and social mobility for the enslaved was at least theoretically possible. These comparisons are not made to minimize the suffering of European captives in Barbary, nor to excuse the Corsair enterprise by pointing to worse abuses elsewhere. Every enslaved person experiences their own slavery as absolute. The fisherman from Cornwall who spent his remaining years rowing a galley did not suffer less because enslaved Africans on Caribbean sugar plantations suffered more. Human misery is not a competition, and the attempt to rank atrocities serves no useful purpose except to provide convenient alibis for perpetrators. But the comparisons do matter historically, because they reveal something important about how the Corsair era has been remembered and forgotten in European and American consciousness. The transatlantic slave trade, despite its vastly greater scale, was for centuries treated as a normal part of economic life, an unfortunate but necessary institution that sensible people accepted. The Barbary Corsairs, by contrast, were demonized from the beginning as monsters, as representatives of a barbaric civilization that threatened everything Europe held sacred. This asymmetry in moral outrage is itself a historical fact requiring explanation. Part of the answer lies in religion. The transatlantic trade was conducted by Christians against non-Christians, which made it easier to rationalize within the theological frameworks of the time. The Barbary trade was conducted by Muslims against Christians, which inverted the expected hierarchy and produced a different kind of moral scandal. A Christian slave owner, in the logic of the period, was exercising legitimate authority over people whom God had placed in a subordinate position. A Muslim slave owner holding Christian captives was committing an offense against the natural order of the universe. This theological framework has largely been abandoned in modern times, but its emotional residue persists. The image of white Christians in chains still carries a shock value that the image of black Africans in chains, through long familiarity, no longer produces with the same intensity. Part of the answer lies in proximity. The Barbary Corsairs raided European shores. They took people from places that European writers knew and could describe. The captives who returned brought stories that circulated in their home communities. The captives who did not return left gaps in families that remembered them. The transatlantic trade, by contrast, happened mostly out of sight. The enslaved Africans came from places that European readers could not locate on a map, from cultures they did not understand, and their suffering took place on distant islands or in colonies that most Europeans would never visit. The difference between visible and invisible suffering shaped the difference in response. and part of the answer lies in the uses to which the memory of Barbary slavery has been put. In the 19th century, the suffering of white Christians under Muslim masters became a powerful propaganda tool for European colonial expansion. The conquest of Algiers in 1830 was justified in part as the liberation of Christian captives and the suppression of a barbaric slave-trading regime. The irony that France was simultaneously running a colonial system that would prove far more destructive to North African populations than the Corsair enterprise ever was. This irony was lost on most contemporaries, or was deliberately suppressed. The memory of Barbary slavery was weaponized in the service of European imperialism, and this weaponization has shaped how the period is still discussed today. The historiography of the Corsairs has gone through several phases. In the immediate aftermath of the Corsair era, European writers tended toward melodrama and demonization. The Corsairs were pirates, barbarians, infidels who had defiled Christendom and deserved whatever punishment they received. This view persisted through much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, reinforced by the colonial ideologies that dominated European thinking about North Africa. In the mid-20th century, a revisionist school emerged that sought to place the Corsairs in their proper Ottoman context, emphasizing their role as legitimate naval forces operating under state authority, their contributions to Ottoman military power, and their integration into the broader political economy of the Mediterranean. This scholarship was valuable in correcting earlier distortions, but it sometimes veered into apologetics, minimizing the violence and suffering that the Corsair enterprise produced. More recent scholarship has attempted a synthesis, acknowledging both the political legitimacy of the Corsair states within their own cultural context and the genuine suffering of their victims, examining the economic structures that made the system function while also attending to the human experiences that those structures produced. This approach is more honest, but it is also more difficult. It requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that the Corsairs were not uniquely evil by the standards of their time, and that what they did was nonetheless terrible, that their victims were real people who deserved to be remembered, and that the Europeans who condemned the Corsairs were often perpetrating similar or worse crimes elsewhere, that the end of the Corsair era was in some sense a liberation, and that it also inaugurated colonial regimes that would prove catastrophic for North African populations. The current state of knowledge is incomplete in ways that cannot be remedied. The archives of the Corsair states themselves were largely destroyed or dispersed during the colonial period. What survives is fragmentary. Account books here, correspondence there, legal records in a third place, none of it comprehensive enough to support the kind of systematic analysis that historians prefer. We cannot know how many captives passed through the markets of Algiers in any given year. We cannot know what fraction of them survived or what became of those who did. We cannot know the names of most of the people who lived and died in the bagnios, or the specific circumstances of their capture, or the details of their daily existence. We can only extrapolate from limited evidence, make educated guesses, acknowledge uncertainty. The oral traditions of the Maghreb contain memories of the Corsair era that academic historiography has largely ignored. Songs, stories, proverbs, family traditions, these carry information that documents do not preserve. But this oral material is difficult to use. It has been shaped by centuries of retelling. It reflects the perspectives of the communities that preserved it, which were not necessarily the perspectives of the captives or the enslaved. It is hard to distinguish genuine historical memory from later invention or romantic elaboration. Scholars who work with this material must balance respect for the communities that produced it against the need for critical evaluation of its historical accuracy. What we can say with confidence is that the Corsair era mattered. It shaped the political geography of the Mediterranean. It influenced the economies of a dozen nations. It altered the demographic composition of coastal populations. It produced a literature, a visual culture, a set of cultural anxieties that persisted long after the last Corsair fleet sailed. It demonstrated that slavery could be profitable, that religiously motivated violence could be economically rationalized, that civilizations at war could nonetheless maintain the commercial relationships that both sides needed to survive. It showed that human beings can adapt to almost any system, can find ways to live and sometimes to thrive within structures that are fundamentally built on the exploitation of their fellow humans. And it reminds us that the boundaries we draw between legitimate and illegitimate violence, between acceptable and unacceptable forms of coercion, between slavery and freedom, are not natural facts, but historical constructions. The Corsairs saw themselves as warriors of the faith, engaged in a holy struggle against the enemies of Islam. The European powers that eventually suppressed them saw themselves as agents of civilization, bringing order and justice to barbarous shores. Both views were self-serving. Both contained elements of genuine conviction, and both produced outcomes that neither side intended or could fully control. The waters of the Mediterranean are quiet now, at least by the standards of the Corsair era. The swift galleys no longer sweep out of hidden coves in search of prey. The watchtowers stand silent on their headlands, monuments to a danger that is past. The descendants of the Corsairs and the descendants of their victims live in the same cities, shop in the same markets, swim in the same sea. The religious boundaries that once divided the Mediterranean have not disappeared, but they no longer produce the systematic violence that characterized the Corsair age. Yet echoes persist in unexpected places. The migration crisis that has convulsed the Mediterranean in recent decades has reversed the direction of dangerous crossings. Now it is Africans and Middle Easterners who risk their lives on the sea seeking to reach European shores. Now it is European coast guards who intercept vessels and return their passengers to places they fled. The moral valences are different, the power relationships inverted, but the underlying reality, that the Mediterranean is a barrier and a bridge, a space of danger and of hope, a sea that connects and divides, remains unchanged. The watchtowers still stand. From Sardinia to the Balearics, from the Calabrian coast to the rocky promontories of Andalusia, they rise from headlands and hillsides like stone fingers pointing at the sea. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, built across 3 centuries by communities that could afford nothing else, but could not afford to go without warning. Most are ruins now, their roofs collapsed, their interiors filled with rubble and wild olive. A few have been converted into private homes, their walls whitewashed, their murder holes sealed, their original purpose obscured by renovation. But they remain, and anyone who walks the coastlines of the Western Mediterranean will encounter them eventually. Squat, cylindrical, positioned always to see the next tower in the chain, designed to pass fire signals from promontory to promontory faster than any ship could sail. They are the physical residue of fear, stones mortared by anxiety. And their presence across such vast stretches of coastline tells us something that documents cannot fully convey, that the Corsair threat was not an abstraction, not a diplomatic problem, not merely a matter for navies and kings. It was a lived reality for millions of ordinary people who spent their entire lives within sight of a sea that might, on any given morning, disgorge armed men who would carry them away forever. The children who grew up in those coastal villages learned to read the horizon the way inland children learn to read the weather. They knew what a sail meant on the morning skyline. They knew the difference between a merchant hull and a Corsair galley. They knew that the tower's fire would give them perhaps an hour, perhaps less, to gather what they could carry and flee inland to whatever fortified refuge their community had prepared. And they knew that if the fire came at night, if the Corsairs achieved surprise, if the winds favored the attackers and hindered the escape, then some of them would not return. This was the texture of life in the Corsair centuries. Not constant terror, but perpetual vigilance. Not daily raids, but the ever-present possibility of raids. The psychological weight of it is almost impossible for modern people to imagine. We lock our doors against individual criminals. We worry about isolated acts of violence. We do not spend our lives within sight of a vast ungoverned space from which organized military forces might emerge at any moment to enslave us and everyone we love. The people of the Mediterranean littoral lived that reality for 10 generations. And then it ended. The French expedition that sailed for Algiers in the spring of 1830 was not, in its origins, a crusade against the Corsairs. It was a political maneuver by a failing government. Charles VI of France, the last of the Bourbon kings, faced mounting domestic opposition that he could neither suppress nor accommodate. His ministers conceived the Algiers expedition partly as a distraction, partly as a demonstration of royal prestige, partly as revenge for a petty diplomatic insult. The Dey of Algiers had struck the French consul with a fly whisk during a quarrel over unpaid debts. The official justifications emphasized the protection of French honor and the suppression of piracy, but the underlying motives were nakedly political, none of which mattered to the 37,000 French soldiers who landed at Sidi Farouk on June 14, 1830, or to the Algerian forces that attempted to repel them, or to the population of Algiers itself, which watched from the city walls as the army that would end their world marched steadily closer across the coastal plain. The Dey Hussein commanded perhaps 50,000 men, a mix of janissaries, tribal cavalry, and urban militia. It was a formidable force on paper, but the French army of 1830 was not the crusading host of Charles V. It was a modern European army, equipped with artillery that could reduce fortifications at ranges the Algerians could not match, organized into disciplined formations that could absorb cavalry charges and counterattack, supplied by a logistical system that could sustain operations indefinitely. The technology gap that had begun to open in the 17th century had become, by 1830, a chasm. The Battle of Staweli, fought on June 19th, demonstrated the disparity. Algerian cavalry swept down on the French positions in waves, displaying the courage and horsemanship that had made them fearsome raiders for 3 centuries. They were cut to pieces by artillery and disciplined musket fire. The French lost 48 men killed. Algerian casualties numbered in the thousands. The geometric superiority of industrial age warfare made individual heroism irrelevant. Within 3 weeks, French forces had established siege positions around Algiers itself, the fortifications that had withstood centuries of attack, that had broken Charles V, humiliated Spanish admirals, repelled knights and crusaders, crumbled under the sustained bombardment of modern artillery. On July 4th, the French breached the walls of Fort l'Empereur, the citadel that controlled the heights above the city. On July 5th, Dey Hussein signed the capitulation that ended 3 centuries of Algerian sovereignty. He was permitted to leave with his family and personal wealth. He retired to Naples, then to Alexandria, where he died in obscurity in 1838. He had ruled Algiers for 12 years. He had followed the path laid down by Hayreddin Barbarossa and 100 days before him. He had maintained the institutions, collected the tribute, launched the raids, negotiated with the European powers, played the ancient game. And in the end, none of it had mattered. The rules of the game had changed, and he had not understood how much they had changed until French shells were falling on his palace. The fall of Algiers sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean. In Tunis and Tripoli, the surviving regencies watched their sister city absorbed into a European empire and calculated their own odds. They were not good. The same technological disparity that had doomed Algiers would doom them equally if the Europeans chose to move. Better, perhaps, to accommodate, better to sign treaties, abolish the slave trade, transform from Corsair states into conventional principalities that posed no threat to European interests. Tunis had already been moving in this direction for decades. The Husseinid dynasty, which had ruled since 1705, had gradually shifted from Corsair economy to conventional taxation and trade. Ahmad Bey, who came to power in 1837, abolished slavery in 1846, before the United States, before Brazil, before many European colonies, and embarked on an ambitious modernization program that included establishing a modern army, a polytechnic school, and a factory for manufacturing military uniforms. It was not enough to preserve Tunisian independence. France would establish a protectorate in 1881, but it represented a genuine attempt to adapt to the new world that European power had created. Tripoli followed a similar trajectory, though with more violence and less success. The Karamanli dynasty, which had ruled since 1711, collapsed in civil war in the 1830s. Ottoman forces re-established direct control in 1835, ending the autonomous arrangement that had allowed the Corsair economy to flourish. The Ottomans had their own reasons for suppressing the remnants of Barbary piracy. International pressure, diplomatic isolation, the desire to present themselves as a modern power, and they proved willing to do what generations of European naval expeditions had failed to accomplish. By 1840, the Barbary Corsairs were gone, not merely defeated, not merely suppressed, but erased from the Mediterranean as a functioning system. The swift galleys were broken up for timber. The banios were emptied and repurposed. The markets where human beings had been bought and sold for 3 centuries fell silent. The entire apparatus that had extracted perhaps 1 million souls from European shores simply ceased to exist. And in Europe, this disappearance was experienced not as liberation, but as vindication. The colonial ideology that would dominate the 19th century drew heavily on the narrative of Barbary suppression. France justified its conquest of Algeria, a conquest that would last 132 years and kill hundreds of thousands, partly as the civilizing of a barbarous shore. The end of the Corsairs became evidence that European power was not merely stronger, but morally superior, that colonialism was not conquest but rescue, that the violence Europeans inflicted was qualitatively different from the violence they had suffered. This was a convenient forgetting. The same European powers that congratulated themselves on ending the Barbary slave trade were simultaneously expanding the Atlantic slave trade to its greatest extent, transporting millions of Africans to the Americas under conditions at least as brutal as anything the Corsairs had inflicted. The same navies that suppressed the Corsairs protected the slave ships that crossed the Atlantic. The same statesmen who denounced the barbarity of Algiers invested in sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans. The moral distinction that Europeans drew between their own slaving practices and those of the Corsairs rested on racial categories rather than on any genuine ethical difference. But this, too, is part of the story. The Corsair era did not end with moral clarity. It ended with the consolidation of one form of power and the destruction of another. It ended with colonialism replacing piracy, with European empires absorbing the territories that had once raided European shores. It ended with the creation of new categories of legitimate and illegitimate violence, categories that served European interests and erased the complexity of what had come before. The descendants of the Corsairs are still there, of course, in Algeria, in Tunisia, in Libya, in Morocco. They are the inheritors of a history that includes the Barbarossas and the Reys, the Janissaries and the Renegades, the Bagnios and the Markets. But that inheritance is complicated. Colonial rule suppressed and distorted local memory. Independence movements created new national narratives that sometimes emphasized the Corsair past and sometimes minimized it. The relationship between modern North African identity and the Corsair era remains contested, unresolved, subject to political appropriation from multiple directions. In Europe, the Corsair era has faded into a kind of romantic obscurity. The watchtowers have become tourist attractions. The captivity narratives have become historical curiosities. The fear that once shaped entire societies has been forgotten because there is no longer any need to remember it. A Mediterranean vacationer can swim off beaches where Corsair galleys once landed, can eat dinner in towns that were raided and depopulated, can admire the watchtowers without understanding what they were built to watch for. The forgetting is not complete. Scholars continue to study the period. Museums preserve its artifacts. Novels and films occasionally revisit its themes. But it is substantial. Perhaps this is inevitable. 3 centuries is a long time, and 4 or 5 generations of peace can erase even the deepest trauma from living memory. The descendants of coastal villagers who spent their lives watching for Corsair sails no longer watch. They no longer need to. The danger has passed so thoroughly that it no longer feels like danger at all, merely like history. And yet, the Mediterranean remains what it has always been, a sea that connects and divides, a space of exchange and conflict, a barrier that people cross at mortal risk. The forms change. The directions shift. The moral categories are redistributed. But the underlying geography persists, and so do the human patterns that geography shapes. In the early morning hours, in the waters between Libya and Italy, Between Tunisia and Sicily, between Morocco and Spain, small vessels still cross in darkness. They are not corsair galleys seeking plunder. They are inflatable boats and rickety fishing craft, overloaded with migrants seeking passage to European shores. The people in them are not raiders but refugees, not warriors but workers, not captors but captives, captives of poverty, of conflict, of climate change, of the global inequalities that the Corsair era helped to create and that colonialism entrenched. They pay smugglers who are the distant descendants in economic function, if not in lineage, of the human traffickers who operated from these same coasts for 3 centuries. And they die sometimes in the same waters where Corsair galleys once hunted. This is not equivalence. The moral situations are different. The power relationships are inverted. The people crossing now are not being taken against their will, but are choosing, under terrible constraints, to risk their lives for the possibility of a better one. The European states that intercept them are not slavers, but border enforcers, acting under legal frameworks and humanitarian obligations that the Corsair era could not have imagined. The comparison is inexact, as all historical comparisons are inexact. But the Mediterranean remembers. The sea itself holds no memory, of course. Water has no consciousness, no moral sense, no ability to judge the uses to which human beings put its vast expanse. Yet, the patterns persist. The crossing points remain. The coastal geographies that made certain locations ideal for launching raids also make them ideal for launching migration attempts. The economic disparities between North and South that once drove the ransom trade now drive the migration trade. The religious and cultural boundaries that once defined the Corsair conflict have not disappeared, but have been reconfigured into new forms of tension, new anxieties, new political movements that draw on very old fears. The watchtowers still stand. They no longer serve their original purpose, but they stand as monuments to a truth that the comfortable centuries since the fall of Algiers have made easy to forget, that the Mediterranean is a dangerous place, that human beings will cross it in search of freedom or profit or survival, that the line between legitimate and illegitimate violence is drawn by the powerful and redrawn when power shifts. The Corsairs understood this. They built their civilization on the understanding. They were erased when European power became strong enough to draw the line differently. And somewhere, in the waters off Lampedusa, in the darkness before dawn, a small boat is probably crossing right now. Its passengers have paid everything they have for the chance to reach a shore that once paid ransoms to the Corsairs, that once built watchtowers to guard against the very people whose descendants are now seeking passage in the opposite direction. History does not repeat, but it rhymes, and the rhymes can be bitter. The Corsair era ended, as all eras end, with the consolidation of new arrangements that the people living through them could not fully understand or control. The French soldiers who landed at Sidi Farouk did not know they were ending 3 centuries of history. The Dey Hussein did not know, when he struck the French consul with his fly whisk, that he was providing the pretext for the destruction of everything he ruled. The European powers that congratulated themselves on suppressing Barbary piracy did not know they were beginning a colonial era that would produce its own atrocities, its own resistances, its own eventual collapse. And we, looking back, cannot know what endings our own actions are beginning, what future historians will see in the choices we are making now that we cannot see ourselves. What remains is the sea. The Mediterranean stretches from Gibraltar to the Levant, ancient and indifferent, carrying the same currents that carried the Barbarossas, the same winds that filled the sails of Corsair galleys, the same salt that preserved the timber of 1,000 ships. It does not remember the raids, the battles, the ransoms, the enslavements. It does not remember the children who watched from watchtowers for the first glimpse of a hostile sail. It does not remember the captives who spent their last strength at oars, or the renegades who found new lives in the faith of their captors, or the religious orders who walked into the markets of Algiers with sacks of coins to buy back Christian souls. The sea carries no memory. It simply is. But we remember. Or we try to remember. We piece together fragments from archives and archaeological sites, from captivity narratives and Corsair logbooks, from the stones of watchtowers and the foundations of bagnios. We argue about numbers, about moral judgments, about the meaning of it all. We draw lessons that serve our present purposes and forget the aspects that do not fit. We make the past useful, and in doing so, we inevitably distort it. The Corsairs were real. The million people they enslaved were real. The fear they inspired was real. The watchtowers they caused to be built are still standing. And the sea they sailed, the ancient inland sea that has carried traders and conquerors, refugees and raiders for 5,000 years and more, is still there, waiting. It is always waiting. In the end, what the Corsair era teaches us, if it teaches us anything, is that the categories we use to organize the world are provisional. Piracy and privateering, slavery and captivity, holy war and criminal enterprise, legitimate violence and illegitimate violence. These distinctions felt absolute to the people who drew them and feel equally absolute to us. But they are not absolute. They are human constructions shaped by power, maintained by force, subject to revision when power shifts. The Corsairs believed they were fighting a holy war. The Europeans who suppressed them believed they were bringing civilization. Both beliefs were sincere. Both were also self-serving. And both produced consequences that neither side intended. The warm waters of the Mediterranean, which once belonged to the Corsairs, belong now to no one in particular. The naval power of a dozen nations patrols them. The commercial vessels of 100 flags cross them. The tourists of every continent swim in them. And the migrants, the modern inheritors of the Mediterranean's ancient function as a space of dangerous crossing, continue to risk everything for the chance to reach the opposite shore. The watchtowers stand silent on their headlands. The stones remember what the water forgets. And somewhere, in an archive in Algiers or Istanbul or Madrid, a document waits, a ship's manifest, a ransom receipt, a captive's letter home that holds a name, a date, a fragment of a life that was lived and lost and almost completely forgotten. Scholars may find it someday, or they may not. The record is incomplete and will always be incomplete. The full story of the Corsair centuries can never be told because most of the people who lived it left no trace. But the watchtowers remain, built by masons whose names are lost, on orders from authorities whose records have crumbled, to guard against a threat that no longer exists. They are what the Corsair era left behind. Stone monuments to a fear that lasted 300 years and then vanished, leaving only ruins on headlands, stories in archives, and a sea that goes on being a sea, waiting for whatever human purposes it will serve next. The oars are still now. The lanterns have gone out. The Mediterranean keeps its secrets, as it always has, and the wind off the water carries no prayers anymore.